The night Blackwater stopped breathing began with the sound of water and fire colliding. Gunshots cracked across the dark lake, brief white flares in the mist, as a ferry burned slow and terrible in the harbor. Men shouted, women screamed, horses reared on the docks, and somewhere in that chaos the Van der Linde gang tried to drag bags of money, wounded friends, and a dying dream of freedom into the teeth of a storm. Pinkerton muzzles flashed from the shadows, sharp and disciplined, answering the gang's wild return fire. Civilians scattered through the smoke, silhouettes stumbling past fallen bodies and overturned crates, while the ferry's lanterns swung crazily over the water. It was supposed to be simple. A boat, a haul of cash and bonds, a quick strike against civilization's coffers before disappearing into the night. Instead, the law was already waiting, the trap already sprung, the docks of Blackwater turning into a killing ground in the span of a heartbeat. This is where the story truly begins. Not in the frozen refuge of Coulter, not with Arthur Morgan shivering on a mountain trail, but here, on a rain-slicked dock where the old ways were dying under electric street lamps and rifle fire. The massacre at Blackwater is the living embodiment of everything that follows, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a family that believed it was untouchable, discovering, in the truest sense, that the world was changing without mercy. Yet this night is never seen directly. It exists as fragments and silences, as Dutch's excuses, as Hosea's weary evasions, as Arthur's haunted questions. Who really fired first? Why were the Pinkertons in position before the gang even stepped off the boat? Who actually died on that ferry and on those docks, beyond the names muttered around lonely campfires? Jenny Kirk, Davy Callender. A girl called Heidi McCourt lying still among the spilled money and broken glass? There are minutes missing from this night, a gap in the tale that no one in camp wants to fill. What did Dutch do when the plan fell apart and the smoke closed in? Whom did he choose to save? And whom did he leave behind on those planks as the gang fled toward the mountains? In that narrow space between the last stand and the last boat out, a philosophy cracked, a leader changed, and the myth of the noble outlaw began to bleed out on the floorboards. This video will return to that dock and rebuild the moment the town stopped breathing. From its humble beginnings as a simple heist to the final shots echoing over the lake. The Blackwater disaster will be reconstructed step by step. The planning and the ferry job, the Pinkerton ambush that should not have been possible, the real body count hidden behind newspaper headlines and wanted posters. It will follow the trail from Blackwater's elite to Angelo Bronte's parlor, through backroom deals and quiet bribes that turned one robbery into a deliberate execution. Because this is not just about a failed score. It is about the night a family broke and never truly healed, the moment John Marston's doubts grew teeth, Micah Bell's whisper found fertile ground, and Arthur Morgan began to see the distance between Dutch's words and Dutch's actions. From that dock forward, every campfire, every argument, every desperate move is haunted by Blackwater, and buried in that haunting is a final question. On that night, on those boards, Dutch made a choice. One act of violence, one person he abandoned, or one lie he told that has never been shown on screen. Unseen, but not unfelt. A single decision that explains everything he becomes, and turns a dying town on the edge of civilization into the point where the entire saga was doomed from the very beginning. That missing decision is where the game begins, but it refuses to show the moment itself. Instead, the story opens in the dark, in a blizzard, with the gang already shattered and stumbling through the grizzlies. The ferry is over. Blackwater is behind them. The very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2 is not the crime, but the consequence. In those first minutes, the chaos has already passed, leaving only exhaustion and fear. Davy Callender is dying in the wagon. Jenny Kirk is gone before the player ever sees her face. Arthur rides through the snow as a silent enforcer, while Dutch tries to sound confident, and Hosea tries to sound calm, yet every word is edged with a panic that never quite gets named. The massacre is an open wound, but the camera never turns back toward the town where it started. Instead, Blackwater lives in whispers. It is argued over around dead campfires in Coulter, muttered in the dark at Horseshoe Overlook, weaponized in cruel moments at Beaver Hollow. The job on the ferry, the bonds, the Pinkertons waiting on the shore, all of it is described, rephrased, denied, and defended, but never actually shown. In the truest sense, it becomes the game's most important unseen event, a story of blood and betrayal that exists only in fragments. That absence changes everything. The player never meets Dutch as the charismatic dreamer in full command, only as a man already reeling, already watching his world collapse. Arthur is already weary, already questioning, already carrying guilt for bodies that fell off screen. John limps back into camp half frozen and half hated, branded a coward for vanishing in the chaos. From its humble beginnings as a simple job, Blackwater has turned the gang into survivors of something unspeakable, and every introduction is colored by trauma that has already happened. The official version is straightforward: the job went bad, the law showed up, the gang had to run. Yet every retelling frays at the edges. Dutch blames the Pinkertons, Micah blames the townsfolk. Locals blame the gang for murdering Heidi McCourt, a young woman shot on the ferry. Newspapers in Blackwater call them butchers, while around the campfire Dutch calls them freedom fighters. Between those two extremes, a different philosophy begins to emerge, one that hints at self-serving lies and quiet omissions. What is being protected, the gang's honor or Dutch's ego? This video treats Blackwater as a crime scene that must be reconstructed. Dialogue, camp conversations, newspaper clippings, side missions, the St. Denis elite, and even the epilogue in A Changed World all become witness statements. Piece by piece, they reveal how Angelo Bronte, the Pinkertons, and the town's own civilization turned a ferry robbery into a slaughter, and how that night reshaped every outlaw who survived it. For Arthur, John, and even Micah, Blackwater is not just a job gone wrong. It is a ghost that rides with them from the snow to the swamps, from the promise of freedom to the graveyard of their dreams. By the end of this investigation, the massacre will stand revealed, not only what happened on that ferry, but why Dutch never truly returns from it, and why the game wanted that absence to haunt every chapter of this tragedy. To understand why Blackwater breaks the Van der Linde gang, the story has to rewind to a quieter time, when Dutch's dreams still felt pure and possible. Before the ferry, before the bounties, there were years when their crimes were smaller, their camps were lighter, and the blood on their hands seemed easier to justify. In those earlier days, the gang moved through the frontier like ghosts on the edge of a vanishing map. They robbed stagecoaches and small banks, held up trains in the middle of nowhere, and disappeared into the trees before the law could even organize a posse. The scores were modest, but the sense of freedom was immense. Around the campfire, Dutch could look at the faces gathered there and claim in the truest sense that this was a family built by choice, not by birth. Dutch's philosophy, from its humble beginnings, was a story of resistance. In his speeches, government and civilization were the real bandits, stealing land, culture, and dignity from ordinary people. His answer was simple and seductive: live free, live outside their rules, steal from the rich parasites who owned the railroads and the banks, and use that money to keep the gang fed, clothed, and mobile. Outlaw life became a political statement, a way to stand against a world that was changing too fast and leaving too many behind. Arthur's journal remembers this Dutch clearly. He writes of Dutch as smarter than the rest of us, a man who could talk a drunk into sobriety or a sheriff into backing down. In camp conversations, Arthur recalls Dutch dragging him out of trouble, insisting that they protect women and children, that they do not kill unless they must. Hosea's wry comments reinforce it. Dutch once turned down an easy score because the town was too poor. This Dutch was charming, idealistic, and genuinely protective, the living embodiment of the dream he preached. At the center of that dream stood a web of relationships that made the gang feel unbreakable. Dutch and Hosea were co-founders, old conmen who had once tried to rob each other and ended up partners instead, bound by decades of shared schemes and quiet compromises. Arthur was Dutch's son in everything but blood, taken in as a teenager, taught to read, to shoot, to think of the gang as home. John Marston arrived later, half wild and angry, another adopted son whose loyalty never felt quite as steady, whose disappearances already worried Arthur. And then, in the late years, came Micah Bell, a smooth-talking gunslinger whose flattery fed Dutch's ego at a time when doubts were starting to creep in. Yet even in those good years, cracks were forming. The railroads were spreading, towns were growing, Pinkerton agents were replacing lazy county sheriffs. The old ways were dying, and the gang felt it every time a once quiet valley sprouted telegraph poles and fences. Their roots shrank, their hiding places thinned, and each robbery required more planning, more risk, more violence. That is why Blackwater is not just another job for Dutch. It is a chance, in his mind, to cash out the entire philosophy. A ferry stacked with money and bonds, a booming town on the edge of modernity, one last spectacular score to buy land far away where the law cannot reach. Freedom, finally paid for in full. But that dream, once a campfire story of escape and brotherhood, is about to collide with a different reality. A civilized port city, powerful men who hit back, and a betrayal that will turn Dutch's ideals into ghosts haunting the shore of Flatiron Lake. The heist that promises everything will instead expose everything. To understand why that promise dies in Blackwater, the town itself has to be seen for what it is. Blackwater is not another muddy crossroads or fading cattle stop. It is the living embodiment of a new America rising on the shore of Flatiron Lake. From its humble beginnings as a river landing, it has become a polished, modern town with brick storefronts, paved streets, and electric lamps burning through the night. Streetcars rattle past neat boardwalks, steam launches cut across the harbor, and there is a real middle class here. Clerks, lawyers, shopkeepers. Families who believe civilization has finally tamed the frontier. The world was changing, and Blackwater is where that change feels permanent. Against that backdrop, the Van der Linde gang looks almost archaic. These are outlaws forged in snowbound cabins, border towns, and mining camps. Men and women used to robbing trains that crawl through canyons and stagecoaches that vanish into the dust. Their story is a story of ambushes in the trees, of quick getaways into wild country, not of slipping unnoticed through gaslit streets watched by policemen on regular patrol. In Blackwater, their worn leathers, long guns, and campfire philosophy feel out of place, fossils wandering through a showroom. Beneath the polished surface, the town's power structure is dense and interconnected. Wealthy businessmen control shipping, rail links, and land speculation. Politicians sit in parlors trading favors, and behind them stand quieter criminal interests, laundering money through respectable fronts. These men dine with judges, contribute to campaigns, and correspond with private agencies such as the Pinkertons, who bring telegraphs, files, and organized surveillance into the game. Here, law and profit are partners, not enemies. Among this Blackwater elite move figures with ties reaching all the way to St. Denis. Investors and landowners share contacts with men like Angelo Bronte, trading information and influence across the lake. To them, the Van der Linde gang is not a romantic band of rebels, but a direct threat to order, to investment, to the illusion that progress has triumphed over chaos. An outlaw killing a girl on a ferry is not a tragedy to be mourned. It is a problem to be solved. Decisively, Blackwater, in the truest sense, symbolizes the end of the old ways. It is organized, mapped, surveilled, and increasingly intolerant of men who claim freedom at the barrel of a gun. The old ways were dying, and Dutch van der Linde can feel it pressing in on all sides. So why target the one town built to crush men like him? Because for Dutch, it is not only about the money in that ferry safe, it is about striking at the heart of the world that is pushing him out, proving that his philosophy still has teeth. That is the fatal mismatch. Old outlaws facing a new connected town already braced for impact. Blackwater has telegraphs, Pinkertons, and men who plan 3 moves ahead. By the time Dutch sets his sights on the ferry, the law is not just waiting to respond. It is already in position, waiting for him. The massacre that follows will not be a simple robbery gone wrong, but the moment the gang discovers that their enemies have been telling a different story from the very beginning. Dutch answers that different story with a promise. Not a rebuttal, not a retreat, but the score of a lifetime. In his mind, Blackwater is not just another robbery. It is the grand finale, the moment his philosophy finally proves itself against a world that insists the old ways were dying. He sells it to the gang around campfires and whispered meetings. A ferry, he says, loaded with cash and bonds, coming into Blackwater under the cover of respectability. No banks to blow, no trains to chase, no long ride under a blood-red sky, just a boat. In Dutch's telling, it will be quick in and out, the last big job before they leave America behind forever. Tahiti, Australia, some distant shore where civilization has not yet closed its iron fist. Mangoes, sun, and freedom. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang has always been chasing that dream in the abstract. Blackwater is the first time Dutch ties it to something concrete. This ferry is not only money, it is passage. The story of their entire outlaw family narrows to one night on the water. The gang listens, each through a different lens. Hosea hears the numbers, the logistics, the risks. He has been at Dutch's side since the very beginning, and the years have worn him down. He warns that the town is too modern, the law too organized, the Pinkertons too close. Dutch waves away the concern, assuring him it will be simple, insisting that the law will never expect them to hit a crowded ferry in broad daylight. Arthur hears something else. He hears Dutch's voice reaching for that old fire, but he also feels the weight of recent close calls. His loyalty is still strong in the truest sense, yet it has become a wary loyalty. He questions the timing, the location, the need for such a spectacle. But when Dutch looks at him as the favored son, asking for trust, Arthur nods. He goes along because that is what family does. John, already drifting at the edges, is more openly skeptical. He has Abigail, Jack, and a growing sense that this life cannot last. To him, Blackwater feels less like a clean exit and more like Dutch trying to outrun the world that was changing around them. Dutch counters with the same refrain, one last score, then paradise. Micah, by contrast, is thrilled. A busy town, a packed ferry, the chance to spill blood and make a statement. To him, Dutch's promise is not a dream of peace, but a license for chaos. He flatters Dutch, feeds his ego, assures him that this is how legends are made. In Micah's eyes, Dutch is the living embodiment of defiance. Beneath the speeches, cracks spread through the foundation. Hosea is tired. Arthur is beginning to see the gap between Dutch's ideals and his actions. John is half gone already, pulled toward a quieter life. Dutch feels that slippage and clings harder to the role of visionary leader, more determined than ever to prove he is still in control of his story. The promise of Tahiti becomes his favorite refrain, a story of mangoes and warm seas that he will later use to keep frightened, hungry people in line. Blackwater is where that promise first fuses with a specific high-risk job, where dreams and delusions become indistinguishable. On the surface, it sounds beautiful. A boat, a fortune, and a road to freedom. But the details of how Dutch plans to pull it off, and the powerful men he is really dealing with in Blackwater, are already turning that dream into something rotten beneath the waterline. On the surface, the Blackwater ferry job is simple. A boat, a strongbox, and a clean ride out of town. But to understand how it curdles into a massacre, the story has to be stripped down to what the game actually proves, not just what the survivors remember. From its humble beginnings, the plan is straightforward. Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur scout Blackwater, a booming town that is the living embodiment of the New West, telegraph wires, paved streets, heavy law presence, and a ferry that regularly carries cash and bonds. The objective is clear in the truest sense. Hit the ferry at the docks, seize a large shipment of money, and use that fortune to buy the gang's way into a different world of freedom, far from civilization's reach. Arthur's scattered remarks, Dutch's bitter recollections, and hushed campfire conversations let that basic outline be reconstructed. The gang moves quietly into the area, splits into smaller groups, and times the robbery for when the ferry is loaded but not yet fully under guard. Dutch, Arthur, Micah, Hosea, John, Javier, and Bill are all explicitly or implicitly tied to the job. Lesser-known members, Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender, are there as well, though their presence is only truly confirmed by the way they die on the way north. The plan does not end at the gangplank. Horses and supplies are stashed beyond Blackwater's limits, ready for a fast escape from the docks, either cutting through the town's back streets or skirting its edge depending on how quickly the law responds. It is a familiar rhythm for this outlaw family: strike hard, scatter, regroup in the wilderness. The old ways were dying, but the Van der Linde method had worked for years. On paper, this is not madness. This is a gang that has robbed trains, stagecoaches, banks, and wealthy estates. One ferry, even in a modernizing port watched by Pinkertons and local deputies, should have been within their capabilities. Dutch keeps insisting it was supposed to be simple. And for once, that is not just delusion. As a design, the job is ambitious, but not suicidal. Yet the gap between that plan and what actually happens is enormous. The law is there almost instantly. Civilian Heidi McCourt ends up dead on the boat, turning a robbery into a public atrocity. Gunfire erupts on the docks and in the streets, and the gang is forced not into a clean retreat, but into a desperate flight north through the mountains, dragging the wounded Davy and leaving Jenny to die later in the snow. How did a contained dockside heist become a town-wide siege so fast? These are the hard facts: the ferry, the money, the named dead, the escape to Coulter, and a town locked down afterward with snipers and bounties. Everything beyond that, how the law knew, who warned them, and what Dutch truly did when the shots started, is where the unanswered questions begin, and where the next part of this story of loyalty and betrayal takes a much darker turn. If the bodies and the bounty were all that remained, Blackwater could be dismissed as chaos. But the pattern of the law's response tells a different story. This was not a town slowly waking up to a robbery in progress. This was a net snapping shut. From the very beginning, characters described the law in Blackwater not as a force arriving, but as a force already there. Dutch talks about Pinkertons and local deputies swarming the docks almost the moment the shooting starts. Townsfolk later speak of agents on rooftops, rifles on balconies, boats in the harbor, as if the entire waterfront had been turned into a killing ground in the space of a heartbeat. That is not how normal law enforcement moves. That is how a trap is sprung. To understand why that matters, it is important to understand who was waiting. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency in this world is the living embodiment of the New Order, a private army of detectives and gunmen, hired by railroads, banks, and the federal government to hunt down outlaws, break strikes, and protect wealth. They are not sheriffs defending their neighbors. They are professionals defending civilization. For men like Milton and Ross, the Van der Linde gang is not just a problem, but a project. So the timing becomes everything. For the Pinkertons to be in position on the docks, with rifles sighted and boats ready, they either received advance warning of the ferry job, or had been watching Dutch's movements so closely that Blackwater was simply the moment chosen to close the book. Both options are damning. Both turn an unlucky encounter into something far more deliberate. Later in the story, Milton and Ross all but admit this. On the ridge above Horseshoe Overlook, Milton tells Dutch and Hosea that they have been tracking the gang for a long time, that Blackwater was not an accident but a failure to finish the job. In Saint Denis, Milton taunts Arthur with the same idea. The gang is predictable, the dream is tired, the hunt is nearing its end. Their dialogue reframes Blackwater as the culmination of a longer pursuit. A story of patience, surveillance, and calculated pressure. That raises the most unsettling question of all. How did they know enough to set the ambush so precisely? Rumors in game hint that Blackwater's elite wanted the gang crushed, that powerful businessmen and civic leaders were in contact with the agency. Others whisper about betrayal much closer to home, a lost soul inside the gang or on its fringes who traded information for money, for freedom, or for sheer survival. Either way, the emotional weight shifts. Blackwater stops being a simple robbery gone wrong and becomes Dutch walking his family into a carefully prepared kill box. His philosophy colliding with a world that was changing faster than he could grasp. And somewhere behind that shifting world stands another figure entirely, a refined crime lord in Saint Denis named Angelo Bronte, whose connections and interests may tie him to that dockside ambush far more tightly than the game ever says out loud. Because Dutch was not the only man in 1899 planning to rob Blackwater's future. Angelo Bronte enters the story far from Blackwater's docks, but his shadow reaches much farther than the streets of Saint Denis. On the surface, he is a gentleman landlord, a patron of the poor Italian quarter. In truth, he is the living embodiment of a new kind of outlaw, one who wears silk, dines with mayors, and sells information as easily as he sells protection. Bronte's world is not built on bullets, it is built on favors. He trades in secrets, in introductions, in quiet conversations over expensive wine. Criminals come to him for permission, and respectable men come to him for deniability. From its humble beginnings as a port city, Saint Denis has become a maze of railroads, telegraphs, and capital, and Bronte has his hands on every wire. The game makes it clear through side comments and missions that his influence runs across state lines, that lawmen tolerate him because he is useful, and that Pinkertons are just another tool in the cabinet of civilization. So how does a refined crime lord in Saint Denis connect to a bloodbath on a ferry hundreds of miles away? The answer is not a direct order shouted across the map, but a pattern. When Dutch meets Bronte, the old outlaw philosophy collides with a man who already works hand in hand with the very forces Dutch claims to resist. Bronte tips off the law when it suits him, shelters criminals when it profits him, and always, always make sure the respectable elite stay one step ahead. The implication is simple and chilling. If men like Bronte exist in Saint Denis, then men very much like him exist in Blackwater. Wealthy investors, railroad men, and politicians who want the freedom to profit without ever getting their hands dirty. They rely on fixers, on brokers of violence and silence, to keep order in a world that was changing faster than Dutch could imagine. These are the men who hear whispers long before a robbery is planned, who know which gangs are hungry, which sheriffs are pliable, which agents are eager for a promotion. Bronte-style power does not fire the first shot. It does something more dangerous. It passes along a rumor, nudges a timetable, quietly assures the Pinkertons that a certain gang will be in a certain place, chasing dreams of easy money. By the time Dutch starts sniffing around Blackwater for a big score, that information does not stay in the saloon. It travels upward, from barkeepers to businessmen, from businessmen to politicians, and from politicians to men who understand that the old ways were dying and must be managed. The game never says Angelo Bronte ordered the ambush at Blackwater. In the truest sense, it does not need to. His very presence in the story shows how the massacre could happen before a single shot is fired, how an outlaw band can walk into a trap set by men they never meet. The Blackwater Massacre is not just a clash between outlaws and lawmen. It is a story of a fading frontier dream colliding with an organized, invisible world of money and influence that Dutch cannot see, cannot shoot, and ultimately cannot escape. If Blackwater is where the dream explodes. The real fracture begins long before on campfires and quiet walks, in conversations between two old men who no longer see the same world when they look at the horizon. Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews had built this gang together from its humble beginnings, one the fiery preacher, the other the seasoned conman, and for years they had been the perfect balance between impulse and restraint. From the very beginning, Dutch was the voice of freedom and rebellion, spinning speeches about civilization as a cage and the gang as the living embodiment of resistance. Hosea was the pragmatist, the man who knew when to disappear, when to smile, when to talk instead of shoot. Together they made their own philosophy work, a story of outlaw family, of loyalty and survival, of dreams that still felt achievable out on the open frontier. But the world was changing. In camp conversations, Hosea's weariness bleeds through. He talks about the old days with a tired fondness, then argues for smaller, safer jobs, robbing a stage here, running a con there, selling bogus moonshine rather than taking on banks and armored cars. He sees railroads multiplying, telegraphs humming, Pinkertons expanding. The old ways were dying, and in the truest sense, he is the only one willing to admit it. Dutch moves the other way. In the months leading up to Blackwater, his plans grow larger, not smaller. He talks about one last big score, a ferry loaded with money and bonds that will set the gang up forever. It is not just a robbery, it is a statement. A final proof that his philosophy was right, that an idealistic outlaw can still outmaneuver an entire system built to crush him. Hosea almost certainly argued against it. Blackwater is too civilized, too full of law and businessmen, too connected to the hidden powers that had already started circling the gang. A ferry in a modern town means witnesses, telephones, Pinkertons on call within minutes. Why not another quiet con in some backwater? Another swindle where no one even draws a gun? Dutch refuses to hear it. He has outsmarted sheriffs, outgunned O'Driscolls, humiliated rich men who thought themselves untouchable. Why not this? Why not now? The disagreement is not just tactical. It is ideological. Hosea is bending to the new world, trimming the gang's ambitions to fit a shrinking frontier, while Dutch doubles down on the old one, insisting that enough courage and enough violence can stop history itself. Caught between them stands Arthur Morgan. His loyalty belongs to Dutch, the man who raised him, yet his respect for Hosea runs just as deep. He hears the arguments, feels the tension, but cannot yet see that this is the foundation cracking, that this is where family and philosophy begin to pull apart. So when the bullets finally start flying on those Blackwater docks, the real question will not only be what went wrong, it will be who Dutch was trying to prove right in that moment, Hosea or himself. But there is another question lurking beneath that argument between Hosea and Dutch, one that will not fully reveal itself until it is far too late. Who else is Dutch really listening to in those final days before Blackwater? Because by then, A new voice has already slipped into the circle. Micah Bell is not from the very beginning. He is no Arthur, raised under Dutch's wing from his teenage years, and no John, taken in as a runaway boy and forged into family through hardship and forgiveness. Micah arrives on the scene only a short time before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2, a latecomer to a story of loyalty and betrayal that was already decades in the making. To the old guard, he is a stranger with a shared profession. To Dutch, he is something more dangerous, a mirror reflecting back the man Dutch wants to believe he still is. From his first appearance, Micah is the living embodiment of the gang's worst impulses, stripped of philosophy and dressed in gunpowder. He is ruthless, opportunistic, and eager for chaos, always pushing for more violence, more bodies, more risk. Where Hosea talks of laying low and picking targets carefully, Micah sneers at caution. Where Arthur mutters doubts under his breath, Micah laughs and reaches for his revolver. In a world where the old ways were dying and civilization presses in from every side, Micah's answer is simple: shoot first, burn the rest. He understands something about Dutch that Hosea has begun to forget. Dutch craves affirmation as much as freedom. Micah feeds that hunger with calculated flattery, praising Dutch's plans as genius, his speeches as prophecy, his brutality as necessary. When Hosea questions, Micah applauds. When Arthur hesitates, Micah urges Dutch to go further. It becomes a pattern, two old men trying to slow the gang down, and one new gun insisting Dutch has been right all along. Through that lens, the Blackwater job takes on a different color. For Micah, this is not just another robbery, it is a stage. A chance to prove himself indispensable, to show Dutch that the future of the gang lies not in careful cons and quiet retreats, but in bold, bloody statements against a world that wants them gone. A ferry loaded with cash and bonds, a wealthy town on the edge of a modern age, an outlaw crew daring the law to stop them. Could there be a more perfect arena for a man who believes in confrontation over subtlety? Later revelations twist that stage into something darker. When it emerges that Micah has been cooperating with the Pinkertons, every earlier moment begins to feel poisoned. If he is willing to sell out the gang at Beaver Hollow, what was he whispering, and to whom before Blackwater? The game never states outright that Micah betrayed them on those docks, yet his pattern of behavior makes him a prime suspect in any theory about how the law knew so much, so fast. For Arthur, that is the hidden wound beneath the massacre. Blackwater is not only the day everything goes wrong, it is the day a late-arriving outlaw's voice begins to drown out his own and Dutch's ear, turning a fragile family into a battlefield of influence that will only grow bloodier from here. To understand how that battlefield of influence explodes, the story has to be rebuilt from its humble beginnings, long before a single shot is fired in Blackwater. The massacre is the end of a chain, not the beginning. And that chain starts with a whisper. Weeks before the ferry ever leaves its moorings, Dutch and Hosea hear about money moving quietly through Blackwater, cash and bonds, the lifeblood of a growing, confident civilization. An underworld contact, maybe a riverboat cheat Hosea once partnered with, mentions a soft ferry run watched by complacent guards. For two aging outlaws who feel the world was changing around them, it sounds perfect. One last grand gesture, one last score to prove their philosophy still means something. Into that window rides Micah Bell. He arrives when Dutch is already dreaming bigger, already tired of scraping by on stagecoaches and train cars. Micah flatters him, feeds those dreams, pushes the idea that a civilized town is not a threat but a stage. Dutch begins to drift from measured robberies towards spectacle, a story of freedom and defiance written right under the nose of the law. In the truest sense, the Blackwater plan is born from that collision between Hosea's caution and Micah's hunger. The gang starts moving toward Blackwater in waves. Javier, Bill, and others slip into town posing as laborers or drifters, mapping alleys, counting patrols, watching the ferry's schedule. Arthur and John ride the surrounding country, picking out gullies and tree lines where weapons can be cached and fresh horses stabled. Wagons bring in supplies under innocent covers. By the time the date is set, the outskirts of Blackwater are quietly wired for escape. On the day itself, everything is divided into roles. Dutch, Hosea, and a tight core handle the ferry and its cargo. Others linger on the docks, ready to provide covering fire. A separate group waits with the getaway horses just outside town. while a few are positioned to start distractions if something feels wrong. It is, on paper, the living embodiment of Dutch's old ways, coordinated, precise, almost elegant. Then the trap springs. Pinkertons and local law step out from cover on rooftops, behind crates, from the very shadows the gang thought it controlled. Gunfire erupts on the ferry and the pier. Civilians scream, and in the chaos a young woman named Heidi McCourt is killed. Her death later echoing through Arthur's guilt. The job collapses in seconds. The old ways were dying, and Dutch is the last to admit it. The retreat is not a clean escape. It is a running gun battle. Davy Callender and Jenny Kirk fall during the flight north, their bodies left behind as the survivors force their way out of Blackwater's tightening noose. Dutch, Arthur, John, Micah, and the rest ride hard into the wilderness, carrying wounded, arguing already about who failed whom, and what betrayal might explain such perfect timing. The timeline ends in snow. Cold, starving, and hunted, the gang reaches the mountains above Coulter, where the game finally opens. The massacre is already finished, but its questions are only beginning, and every argument around those campfires will circle back to the same night on the water, and the same terrible choice Dutch made when the law stepped out of the dark. This reconstruction is not guesswork for its own sake. It is the only sequence that fits every stray line of dialogue, every consequence seen in Blackwater's lockdown and the epilogue's haunted conversations. The massacre is more than a prologue. It is the hinge on which the entire Vanderlinde story turns. If Blackwater is the hinge of the Vanderlinde story, its weight is measured in bodies. The massacre is not just a failed score or a tactical mistake. It is a roll call of names that will never answer again, the human cost behind the bounty posters and headlines screaming about outlaw monsters. From the very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2, death rides with the gang into the snow. Davy Callender is already fading when the player first sees him, slumped in the wagon, bleeding through his coat. He never gets a heroic last stand or a stirring speech. He coughs, he groans, he shivers, and then, in a cramped room above Coulter's saloon, he dies while Dutch and Hosea argue about what went wrong. In the truest sense, Davy is the bridge between the unseen chaos in Blackwater and the desperate exile in the mountains. Jenny Kirk does not even receive that much screen time. Her absence is felt more than her presence is ever shown. Mentioned in campfire conversations and quiet reminiscences, she emerges as a younger member of the gang, someone the others had taken in and tried to protect. Uncle remembers her kindly. Bill and Javier speak of her with an awkward, halting respect. There is no lurid detail, no sensational retelling of how she died, just a shared, lingering sadness. Jenny becomes the living embodiment of what the gang claims to stand for, a family that failed one of its own. Then there is Heidi McCourt, the name that civilization remembers. While Davy and Jenny vanish into outlaw memory, Heidi's death is written into the public record, into accusations, into Dutch's legend. A civilian on the ferry, and innocent by every account, she is the woman Dutch is said to have shot in the head during the chaos. Her story is a story of two worlds colliding, the gang's dreams of freedom and the town's belief in order, loyalty, and law. Newspaper clippings, wanted posters, whispered conversations in Blackwater streets all circle back to that single moment on the deck of a burning boat. Around them are the unnamed. Townsfolk trampled in the panic, lawmen gunned down on the docks, Pinkertons pulled under the dark water. The game never tallies them, but their absence shapes the atmosphere. Blackwater goes into lockdown, snipers watch the roofs, bounties soar. The old ways were dying, and the town responds by hardening into a fortress. For the gang, those deaths hollow out the camp. There are empty bedrolls at Coulter, missing voices around the fire, chores reassigned because someone is never coming back. Conversations trail off when Blackwater is mentioned. Dutch changes the subject. Hosea's eyes drop. The philosophy that once promised a better world now sounds brittle, rehearsed. Arthur feels it most acutely. His journal sketches out what the dialogue only hints at: guilt over Jenny and Davy, unease about Heidi, doubt about Dutch's choices. When Blackwater comes up, his tone flattens, his questions sharpen, and his gaze lingers on Dutch a moment too long. Is this still a family, or is it becoming something else? In the end, the massacre is not merely about a plan that failed. It is about the people who never left that river town, the lost soul on the ferry and the young outlaws in the snow, and how their absence haunts every camp the van der Linde gang will ever build after. But among all those ghosts from Blackwater, one name begins to harden into legend and accusation: Heidi McCourt. Her story is simple and horrifying. In the chaos on the docks, as the ferry job dissolved into a blind exchange of gunfire, a young woman was shot and killed. The lawmen of Blackwater would give her a name, a face, and a purpose. Heidi McCourt became their proof that the van der Linde gang were not tragic outlaws or romantic bandits, but butchers who murdered innocent civilians in cold blood. For them, she was the living embodiment of Dutch's fall from grace. Yet the game never shows that moment. There is no cutscene of Dutch pulling the trigger, no slow motion shot of a terrified girl caught between the gang and the law. Instead, it is a story of secondhand whispers and pointed silences. Pinkertons hiss the accusation. Blackwater newspapers print it as established fact. Bounty posters and wanted notices speak of a massacre on the docks, a dead girl on a ferry, and a gang that fired into a crowd. Inside the camp, whenever her name surfaces, voices trail off, eyes shift, and the conversation moves on. That absence is deliberate. From the very beginning, the massacre is framed as something remembered but never fully seen. A wound everyone circles but refuses to open. Was Dutch set up and forced into an impossible choice? Did a stray bullet find Heidi in the smoke? Or did a man who once preached about protecting the weak finally see a civilian as just another obstacle between him and freedom? Dutch's own reactions only deepen the ambiguity. When confronted with Heidi McCourt, he does not grieve, and he does not confess. He deflects. He blames the law, the Pinkertons, the rich of Blackwater, the whole machinery of civilization that, in his mind, left him no other option. He insists the job was supposed to be simple, that something went wrong, that betrayal came from somewhere else. He never quite says, "I did not shoot her." He never quite says, "I did." Narratively, Heidi's death becomes a line in the sand. Before Blackwater, Dutch's violence is framed as targeted and almost idealistic, aimed at banks, railroads, and people he can call corrupt. After Blackwater, his cruelty grows more erratic, more self-justifying, more detached from the philosophy he uses to rally his family. The old ways were dying, and in that dying world, Dutch begins to decide that any cost can be explained away. Whether he meant to kill Heidi McCourt almost becomes secondary. What truly matters is that he finds a way to live with it. In the truest sense, that is where something inside him breaks. A man who once drew a bright line between his gang and the monsters hunting them discovers he can cross it, then tell himself a story where he remains the hero. From its humble beginnings, the gang had followed Dutch as a prophet of freedom. After Blackwater, they follow a man already learning how to carry blood he once swore he would never spill. And the next time innocent lives stand between Dutch and his dreams, he will not hesitate for long. When the gang finally circles back toward Blackwater, the town is no longer just a name on a wanted poster. It is a wound turned into a fortress. The player does not ride into a bustling frontier port chasing dreams of easy money. They approach a city bristling with rifles, patrols, and a memory that has not healed. From the very beginning of that return, Blackwater feels wrong in the truest sense. The streets are paved, the storefronts polished, the lamps electric. Yet the atmosphere is tighter than any backwater jail. Lawmen ride in pairs along the main road, Pinkertons linger at corners, and checkpoints choke the approaches. Cross an invisible line and rifles snap up with mechanical precision. The town that once promised prosperity now lives under permanent inspection. Its people have learned to live with the ghost. Conversations on porches and in saloons circle back to the ferry, to the bodies on the docks, to the butchers from the van der Linde gang. NPCs mutter about outlaws as if they were a plague, not a dying breed. Newspapers frame the massacre as the defining trauma of a generation, the day civilization itself was attacked. For Blackwater, this is not just another crime, it is the story of who they became afterward. Over time, the ferry incident hardens into legend. Parents warn children about wandering too close to strangers with long coats and longer guns. Politicians and businessmen invoke that night whenever they demand more deputies, bigger jails, stricter rules. The massacre becomes a cautionary tale. Freedom without law leads to blood on the river, and only relentless control can keep the world safe. Dutch once sold a philosophy of noble rebellion. Blackwater now sells the opposite. and the town is the living embodiment of that bargain. In this, Blackwater mirrors the broader arc of the game. The world was changing. The old ways were dying, not only in the open plains and fenced ranches, but inside people's minds. Communities that once romanticized the wandering outlaw now choose rail schedules, bank vaults, and federal agents over campfires and tall tales. Faced with the memory of chaos, they decide that strict order is a fair price for never seeing another dock run red. By the epilogue, John Marston walks these streets as a man both invisible and exposed. Most faces do not recognize him, yet the place does. Every poster, every wary glance at a gunslinger's holster reminds him that his family once helped carve this scar. He moves through Blackwater as a lost soul, haunting his own crime scene, trying to build a ranch in a town that still whispers about the gang that ruined everything. For the townsfolk, the Blackwater Massacre is the day the romantic outlaw died. For the gang, it is the day they learn civilization will never forgive them. And as Blackwater tightens its grip in fear, Dutch tightens his grip in paranoia, both sides living in the shadow of the same night. Staring at each other across a river that can never be crossed back. For Dutch, that river is not just a line on a map, it is a fracture in his own mind. On one bank stands the noble outlaw he believes himself to be. On the other, the paranoid warlord he is about to become. Before Blackwater, Dutch is the living embodiment of his own philosophy. Charismatic, theatrical, endlessly persuasive, he speaks of freedom and family in the truest sense. He rescues lost soul after lost soul, promises that no one will be left behind, and tells Arthur and John that they are the future, not the past. When violence comes, it is framed as necessary, even righteous, a story of resistance in a world where the old ways were dying. Then comes the ferry. Then comes Heidi McCourt. Then come Jenny and Davy, bleeding out in the snow while Dutch insists the plan was sound. In the mountains above Coulter, the man who once seemed unshakable already sounds brittle. He repeats that the job was supposed to be simple, that the law set them up, that nobody could have known. He is not just explaining, he is rehearsing a defense against his own guilt. Blackwater attacks every pillar of his identity at once. His belief in his own brilliance is shattered by a plan that collapses on contact with reality. His promise to protect the gang is mocked by the bodies left behind and the coughing, dying boy in the wagon. His dream of one last, clean score leading them away from civilization is poisoned by the fact that their biggest job becomes their greatest shame. How does a man built on certainty survive that kind of failure? Dutch's answer is simple. He does not bend. He hardens. Instead of questioning himself, he doubles down, insisting the world was changing. Insisting civilization and the Pinkertons and invisible enemies ruined everything. The law becomes not just an opponent, but an all-consuming conspiracy. Every setback is proof that he was right, that the system is rigged, that only he can see clearly. From that point on, his behavior shifts. He grows secretive, hiding plans even from Hosea and Arthur, the two men who once knew every step before he took it. He starts risking lives to preserve his pride, refusing to abandon doomed schemes, because to do so would admit that Blackwater was not a fluke. He gravitates toward Micah, a man who never questions, only flatters, turning Dutch's philosophy into a blunt instrument of flattery and blood. The deaths from Blackwater become his justification. Heidi McCourt, Jenny, Davy, these are recast as sacrifices, necessary costs on the road to freedom. The protective father who once swore to shield his family becomes a commander talking about acceptable losses. It is from its humble beginnings as a gang of idealistic thieves to this moment that the transformation is clearest. Dutch stops leading a dream and starts waging a personal war. If Blackwater is where Dutch begins to fall, the real question is not how far he goes, but who he drags with him. The rest of Red Dead Redemption 2 is the story of that descent, and of how Arthur, John, and the others slowly realize that the man they trusted has become the very monster he once swore to fight. Dutch's descent begins with a plan he believes is flawless. Before Blackwater becomes a massacre, it is, in his mind, the living embodiment of everything the gang has ever stood for, one last elegant score that proves an outlaw can still outthink civilization. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang survived by moving light and striking smart. Blackwater is meant to be the culmination of that philosophy, not its grave. The idea is simple on paper. The gang slips into town quietly, posing as ranch hands, drifters, harmless travelers. No grand speeches, no show of force. Dutch and Hosea have already scouted the docks, timed the patrols, and learned the ferry's schedule. The job is to let the town fall asleep in its own confidence, then wake it up with a single, decisive blow. The target itself is deliberate. A ferry, not a bank. Why? Because a ferry concentrates wealth in one narrow space and locks it to a predictable timetable. Cash and bonds, guarded but confined, floating on water with limited exits. In Dutch's mind, this is a story of control. No crowded street, no chaotic crowd, no random gunmen spoiling the moment. Just a boat, a gang, and a clean escape into the Great Plains before the law even understands what has happened. The roles are divided with equal precision. Men on the dock, men on the boat, men on the horizon. Javier, Bill, and others are positioned near the gang's horses and wagons, ready to break for the plains the second the signal comes. Arthur and John are close to the action, trusted to move between dock and ferry, watching for trouble and shepherding hostages. Micah, ever eager, is placed where sudden violence can be turned into intimidation. Hosea oversees the town's edge, studying the response, prepared to call a retreat if Blackwater stirs faster than expected. In the truest sense, Dutch treats the heist like a battlefield, every man a piece in a carefully arranged formation. On paper, it borders on genius. The ferry leaves. The gang boards at the last moment, disarms the guards, secures the strongbox and the bonds, and keeps the passengers alive as leverage. A few minutes of terror, then silence. The gang slips back to shore, mounts up, and vanishes into the sea of grass, leaving Blackwater's law arguing over jurisdiction while the Pinkertons scramble too late. Dutch imagines headlines calling them butchers, yet secretly impressed by the precision. But the plan hides a fatal assumption. Dutch believes the world is still slow. He believes the old ways were dying only out there, on the frontier. Not in towns where telegraphs hum, rail lines converge, and men like Milton and Ross can be waiting before the first shot is fired. He expects scattered deputies, not coordinated lawmen and Pinkertons working as one. That is the crack in the foundation, the quiet flaw beneath the bravado. From the very beginning, Blackwater is not an echo of the gang's glory days. It is a collision with a new order that has already mapped every move. The next step is simple and catastrophic. What happens when Dutch's perfect plan meets a world that has finally learned how to hunt him? When Dutch's perfect plan meets a world that has finally learned how to hunt him, the next variable is not the Pinkertons, or the ferry, or the city itself. It is the man who has been whispering in his ear. Micah Bell does not cause Blackwater on his own, but in the truest sense, he bends its shape. In the weeks leading up to the job, camp life shifts in subtle, telling ways. Dutch and Hosea still sit together, arguing philosophy and strategy, but there is a new shadow at Dutch's shoulder. Micah rides closer on scouting trips. He lingers by the fire when Dutch speaks, offering quiet asides that flatter, not question. Arthur notices, Hosea notices, yet their instinct is caution, not confrontation. They have known Dutch from its humble beginnings. Micah has known him for a season and already acts as if he is the living embodiment of Dutch's future. This is where proximity becomes power. Arthur and Hosea urge restraint, smaller scores, clean exits, a graceful adjustment to a world that was changing. Hosea, still haunted by failed cons and close calls, presses for bonds, not blood. Arthur, ever practical, worries about the town's growing law presence and the rumors of Pinkertons sniffing around Blackwater's docks. Their advice leans toward survival, family, and a controlled retreat from the spotlight. Micah argues the opposite. To him, the ferry is not just a job, it is a stage. He pushes for a bigger take. More money, more bonds, more time on the boat. Dutch, bruised by years of chasing dwindling returns, hears exactly what his ego craves. Proof that the gang is still powerful, that the old ways were dying for others, not for him. When Dutch talks about slipping in and out, Micah counters with the promise of a statement, a story of freedom shouted in the face of civilization. Reconstruct that final conversation on the eve of the heist, and a pattern emerges. Hosea argues that the plan is already good enough. Arthur warns that staying longer means more eyes, more guns, more risk. Then Micah leans in, voice low, telling Dutch that walking away from easy money would make him look weak, that the rich in Blackwater will never fear his name if he plays it safe. Two men trying to rob the same world, one stealing its money, the other stealing its leader. So the plan swells. Stay a little longer, take a little more. Trust that the law will blink first. Was this just Micah's reckless ambition? His hunger to leapfrog Arthur in Dutch's affections? Or was there something colder beneath the bravado? Some unseen hand guiding him toward a massacre that certain interests in Blackwater quietly desired? Because by the time the gang steps onto that ferry, the law is not guessing. It is waiting. And Micah Bell is exactly where he insisted on being when the first shot is fired. The first shot is the wound no one in the Vanderlinde gang can quite look at directly. Everyone remembers the screaming, the smoke, the bodies on the deck, but ask who pulled the trigger and the story fractures into half-truths and self-preservation. In gang campfire tales, that uncertainty becomes its own kind of shield. Javier swears the lawmen opened up without warning. Bill insists some damned hero guard went for his gun. Micah, ever the survivor, leans on the chaos, claiming it all happened too fast to tell. Dutch himself shifts the blame with the wind, railing against Pinkertons, bankers, and progress. Because admitting that the very beginning might have been his mistake would crack the philosophy he built his family on. Yet the broad outline is clear. The ferry is already in motion when the gang makes its move, weapons drawn, faces covered, the air thick with shouted orders and terrified passengers. The safe is located, the cash and bonds are being hauled, and for a brief, suspended moment it resembles countless other robberies in their long story of outlaw bravado and improvised order. This is what Dutch promised. A clean job, quick and decisive, one last leap toward freedom before the world was changing for good. Then someone twitches. Maybe it is a nervous guard, hand inching toward a holster as he watches Heidi McCourt held at gunpoint. Maybe it is a Pinkerton man on the deck above, misreading a gesture as the long-awaited signal. Or perhaps it is Dutch himself, seeing motion in the corner of his eye and deciding, in an instant, that hesitation is death. A single muzzle flashes. Heidi falls. In the truest sense, the massacre begins with a dead girl no one meant to kill. What turns that mistake into a slaughter is what has been waiting in the dark. The evidence scattered through Blackwater gossip and Pinkerton boasts suggests the law was not scrambling. It was positioned. Rifles already sighted from the shore. Agents and deputies hidden among crew and passengers. Boats ready to close the gap. All they needed was a prearranged cue, some unmistakable sign that the gang had committed, and that first shot, whoever fired it, becomes the spark that lights every barrel at once. Within seconds, control evaporates. Gunfire rakes the ferry from the docks and from within. Civilians bolt in every direction, some diving into the black water, others trampled under boots. The deck becomes a maze of splintered wood and falling bodies. The echoes of shots bouncing off the lake so wildly that no one can tell where death is coming from. For the gang, this is the moment the dream shatters. Dutch's careful speeches about codes and restraint mean nothing in a blind crossfire. Arthur is dragging the wounded. John is separated. Jenny and Davy are hit in the desperate retreat that follows. What was meant to be a precise blow against civilization has become the living embodiment of its worst fears, outlaws and lawmen turning a pleasure ferry into a killing ground. And as the survivors flee toward the snow, each carries a different version of that first shot, a different story of guilt and betrayal, that will fester through Coulter, through St. Denis, and all the way to Beaver Hollow. In all that chaos, in all that gunsmoke and screaming, the event that defines Blackwater is not a pile of bodies or a blown safe. It is one girl, on one deck, in one frozen instant. Heidi McCourt becomes the moment Dutch van der Linde stops being an outlaw with a philosophy and becomes, in the eyes of the world, a murderer in the truest sense. Heidi is never met on screen. She has no campfire scenes, no satchel notes, no long speeches about freedom or civilization. She exists in fragments, a name on the Pinkerton's tongue, a detail in a newspaper column, the quiet horror in Arthur's voice when he recalls what Dutch did. She is the living embodiment of everything Dutch always claimed his gang did not do. A civilian, a passenger, a young woman caught on a pleasure ferry that was meant to be far from the old ways of frontier violence. The story, as the world hears it, is simple and damning. Amid the robbery, Heidi McCourt ends up in Dutch's hands, a hostage or a shield, as the Pinkertons close in. She is unarmed. Defenseless, Dutch, cornered and furious, puts a bullet in her. Lawmen repeat it. Pinkertons weaponize it. The Blackwater ledger prints it until the ink itself feels accusatory. Whatever Dutch intended, the story that survives is a story of a gang leader gunning down a terrified girl to cover his escape. This is not another train guard shot in a firefight. Not another bounty hunter who chose the wrong camp to raid. From the very beginning, Dutch's code rested on a single, fragile promise: no unnecessary killing of innocents. He would rob railroads, banks, and wealthy men who hid behind civilization's laws. But he would not become the brute the world accused him of being. Heidi's death snaps that line. In one shot, Dutch crosses the boundary he spent decades drawing between himself and the men he despised. For the gang, the impact is uneven, almost surreal. Some cling to Dutch's version that it was an accident, a necessity, a tragic blur in a planned escape gone wrong. Others, especially Arthur, feel that something sacred has been broken, even if no one dares say it outright. How can a family built on loyalty and shared dreams look at its leader the same way, knowing a girl's blood is on his hands? Yet the snow is closing in, Pinkertons are hunting, and survival demands silence. Outside, there is no such silence. In Blackwater, Heidi McCourt becomes the massacre. Her name is whispered in saloons, shouted in courtrooms, muttered by Pinkerton agents as justification for every noose and bullet that follows. The world was changing, and now Dutch's gang is no longer romantic highwaymen resisting progress. They are child killers. Monsters, proof that the old ways were dying for a reason. That single shot will echo through Coulter, through St. Denis, through Beaver Hollow. It will haunt Arthur's doubts, feed Dutch's paranoia, and stand as the one sin even his most loyal followers cannot quite explain away. That sin does not stand alone. Blackwater is not just the day a girl died on a ferry. It is the moment the gang begins to lose people it can never replace, the moment the family Dutch built from its humble beginnings starts to bleed out in the snow. Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender are the quiet ghosts of this story. They are not given grand death scenes or heroic last stands. Jenny was a young woman who had thrown in with Dutch's outlaws in the truest sense, not as a hostage or a camp follower, but as one of them, a believer in the philosophy of freedom Dutch sold under the banner of family. Davy was a loyal gun, a steady presence in the background, one of those men who filled the campfire with laughter and the firing line with lead. Their importance is measured in absence. No long speeches mourn them. No mission sends the gang back for revenge. Instead, their names surface in passing, half swallowed by the wind. Arthur mentions Jenny as someone who died on the way, almost apologetic, as if the words themselves might reopen a wound. Dutch mutters about Davy, dying slow in the wagon as they push up into the mountains. And there is a flicker of something human before the paranoia takes over. Reconstructing their deaths is a story of chaos and retreat. The ferry job explodes into gunfire, Heidi McCourt falls, the Pinkertons close in, and in that panicked flight from Blackwater, Jenny and Davy are hit. Not clean, instant kills, but the cruel kind of wounds that let a person hope for a while. They are dragged to boats, hauled onto wagons, bundled in blankets as the gang rides for the grizzlies, clinging to the dream that once they reach safety, once they reach Coulter, things will be all right. They never are. Davy dies in the blizzard, delirious and broken, his blood soaking into the boards of a stolen cabin. Jenny does not even make it that far, slipping away somewhere between the civilized streets of Blackwater and the frozen teeth of the mountains. The world was changing, and these two are its proof. Not legends, not wanted posters, just bodies left behind on the road to survival. Their deaths deepen the curse of Blackwater. This is no longer a simple failed robbery. It is the point where the gang's history starts to unravel, where every move forward costs another piece of its heart. If Dutch and Hosea were the living embodiment of the gang's ideals, Jenny and Davy are the cost of those ideals colliding with civilization. Listen to how Arthur and John speak of them. A name dropped by a campfire, a line of regret in a journal, a bitter aside about how many died for nothing. Those small echoes hint at a much larger well of guilt, a private reckoning that no one in this family quite dares to face. Because if Jenny and Davy died for Dutch's dreams, what does that say about the dreams? What does that say about the man? And Blackwater is not done taking from them. The ghosts at Coulter are only the beginning. Blackwater does not become a graveyard by accident. From the very beginning, forces far beyond Dutch's control are already moving, already watching, already waiting for an excuse to turn one more simple job into a public execution of an entire philosophy. For years before the ferry, the Pinkertons have been circling the Van der Linde gang. Dutch is no longer just another outlaw. He is a symbol, the living embodiment of resistance to the new order. His speeches about freedom, his habit of robbing banks and railroads, his talent for slipping through the cracks of civilization, all of it turns him from nuisance to obsession. Agents start tracking patterns, which towns he favors, which kinds of scores he prefers, which allies he relies on when the world was changing and the noose tightens. Reports pile up in offices far from the mud and blood. Dutch hits places where money moves in bulk, but security still believes in the old ways, still trusts a few guards and a badge to keep order. He avoids the biggest cities, but he is drawn, again and again, to growing boomtowns on the edge of the frontier. Blackwater fits that pattern perfectly. It is a story of a town that wants to be the future, yet still stands close enough to the past for men like Dutch to imagine it vulnerable. Blackwater's elite see something different. To them, the gang is not romantic, it is bad for business. Wealthy ranchers, investors, and railroad men have poured their dreams into this lakefront experiment in modernity. They want telephones, paved streets, steam ferries, and quiet nights. They do not trust a handful of underpaid deputies to protect all that. So they hire the Pinkerton Detective Agency, in the truest sense a private army for private interests, to make sure Blackwater never becomes another cautionary tale. That money buys more than gunmen. It buys information. Down on the docks, stevedores and clerks hear rumors of a big shipment, cash and bonds moving by ferry, an easy score to anyone still believing the old ways were dying but not yet dead. Conversations are overheard in saloons, wagers are made in back rooms, and every loose tongue is another thread in a growing net. Some of those threads lead straight toward the Van der Linde camp. The flow of information is messy, but relentless. Anxious officials talk too loudly. A dock worker passes word for a few extra dollars. Somewhere, perhaps, a man close to the gang decides that loyalty is worth less than a pardon. Was it a former contact from St. Denis' underworld, an associate of Angelo Bronte, or someone within Dutch's own circle who whispered too much? The game never answers outright, but the pattern is clear. Blackwater does not stumble into an ambush. It walks into one. By the time Dutch steps onto that ferry, the net is already drawn. Deputies are posted at the harbor edges, rifles ready. Pinkerton agents blend with guards and passengers, watching faces, waiting for tension to break. The town's private security stands in the shadows, eager to prove their worth. One wrong movement, one gunshot, one dead girl on a gangplank, and everything erupts. From its humble beginnings as easy money, the job becomes a massacre on cue. In that moment, Dutch believes fate has turned on him. In truth, the world has simply caught up, and the trap that closes around him in Blackwater will not truly open again until the final shots ring out years later on a very different cliff. But that cliff in Blackwater does not belong to Dutch alone. In the shadows behind the gunsmoke, another figure is already counting the cost and the profit. Angelo Bronte, the gentleman crime lord of St. Denis, never sets foot in Blackwater on screen. Yet his world reaches there long before the gang ever boards that ferry. Bronte is the living embodiment of what Dutch claims to hate and secretly wants to become. A man who wears civilization as armor, who hosts dinners for judges and bankers while his men drown rivals in the bayou. From its humble beginnings, his empire is built on one simple principle: chaos is only a problem when it is not controlled. And Blackwater, that polished frontier jewel with its banks, investors, and telegraph lines, is exactly the kind of place where men like Bronte make sure chaos serves their interests. The game hints, quietly, that the world was changing long before Dutch notices. Blackwater has a bank ready to handle large bonds, politicians eager for Eastern money, and lawmen who answer to more than a local sheriff. When Arthur later walks the streets of St. Denis, he hears Bronte's name tied to judges, police, and financiers. Is it really a stretch to imagine similar men, perhaps even Bronte's associates, holding stakes in Blackwater's prosperity? A story of capital, influence, and fear runs underneath the gunfire on that boat. In that light, the response to the massacre stops looking like panic and starts looking like policy. The town locks down overnight. Bounties spike to absurd levels. Pinkertons, not just local deputies, take control of the hunt. Snipers watch the streets, and the mere presence of a Vanderlinde outlaw turns Blackwater into a killing field. This is not a community in shock. This is a machine defending its investments and its image. Men like Bronte understand the power of a message. A harsh sentence here, a public hanging there, a disappeared rival in the swamp. The philosophy is simple. Make one example, and thousands will fall in line. So when an idealistic gang storms into a polished town with dreams of easy money and freedom, whose interests are served by making their failure as bloody and public as possible? Whose world is protected when Dutch's noble outlaw fantasy is turned into a newspaper horror story? From the very beginning, Blackwater is treated less as a crime scene and more as a stage. The heavy law presence, the relentless pursuit, the refusal to let the town move on, all of it sends a clear warning. The old ways were dying, and those who refused to adapt would not simply be arrested, they would be erased. Blackwater, then, is not just a robbery gone wrong. It is a demonstration in the truest sense, a brutal lesson from the new American order to every lost soul still chasing the frontier. And somewhere between St. Denis drawing rooms and Blackwater boardrooms, a question hangs unspoken. Who really ordered that lesson to be taught? Blackwater answers that question not with a signature, but with soldiers in the street. By the morning after the ferry job, the town that once sold itself as the civilized jewel of the West wakes up under guard. Lanterns burn late over the docks, rifle barrels glint in the fog, and the blood that ran between the planks becomes a whispered landmark in every conversation. Patrols move in pairs and in platoons, boots striking boards that, days earlier, had carried tourists and traveling salesmen. Now every corner has a badge or a uniform, sometimes both, arguing in low voices over jurisdiction while sharing the same suspicion. Posters go up on walls still damp from river spray, crude sketches of Dutch, Javier, Bill, names half remembered by dockhands who only saw muzzle flashes. Men who were once just rumors in saloons are recast as the living embodiment of frontier evil. Commerce, the true god of Blackwater, does not stop, but it no longer feels free. Ferries still cross the lower Montana, yet each arrival is met by deputies counting heads and checking manifests, their questions turning every passenger into a suspect. Trains roll in under the watch of Pinkerton agents who never show their badges until it is already too late. Strangers are pulled aside, trunks forced open, accents noted. This was a town that had thrived on movement and anonymity, on the promise that anyone could step off a boat and disappear into the West. That promise dies on the docks with Heidi McCourt. In the very beginning, Dutch's philosophy depended on that looseness, on a world where the gaps between law and civilization were wide enough for an idealistic outlaw to slip through. Blackwater's lockdown closes those gaps. The same streets where Dutch once passed as a harmless eccentric now hum, with a new order that knows his name, his face, his crimes. Freedom narrows to a corridor watched from both ends. Newspapers do the rest. Broadsheets hit the stands with headlines screaming about massacre and atrocity, about a girl on a ferry shot down without mercy. Heidi McCourt becomes the centerpiece, the innocent that turns a story of robbery into a national parable about savagery. Was she killed in panic, by accident, in the chaos Dutch never fully explains? The details do not matter to an audience hungry for certainty. Rumor fills in what fact cannot, and every retelling makes Dutch colder, crueler, less human. By the time those papers reach St. Denis parlors and New York boardrooms, Dutch is no longer a regional nuisance. He is a symbol, a problem to be solved. The world was changing, and Blackwater offers the perfect justification for more agents, more rifles, more wire strung across the continent. The old ways were dying, and men like Dutch are recast not as rebels against a rigged system, but as diseased remnants to be cut out. Years later, when another lost soul named John Marston rides through Blackwater in Red Dead Redemption, the transformation is complete. The rough timber and open docks have given way to paved streets, electric lamps, and orderly storefronts. Snipers sit on rooftops, unseen but always implied, an invisible continuation of those first frantic patrols. This is Blackwater as the polished, controlled face of the new America, prosperous, efficient, and utterly intolerant of outlaws who pretend that the frontier still exists. The town that once needed Dutch's legend now needs his extinction. Yet beneath the glass windows and brick facades, the memory of the lockdown lingers. How many fortunes in that city trace back to the fear that followed the ferry? How many careers were built on promising that such chaos would never be allowed again? The massacre does not just end a gang's dreams, it helps cement a philosophy of order that will hunt the Van der Linden name across mountains and swamps. And as the story moves from Blackwater's sealed harbor to the gang's frozen exile in Coulter, that invisible pressure will shape every desperate choice they make next. That pressure does not just bear down on the gang as a whole, it presses hardest on the man who once believed Dutch most. For Arthur Morgan, Blackwater is not only a disaster on the ledger, it is the first real fracture in a faith that had guided his entire life. From its humble beginnings, Arthur's loyalty to Dutch had been almost religious. Dutch found him as a teenager, a lost soul with a dead father and no future, and gave him a new name for the world. Outlaw, yes, but also son, student, believer. Dutch's campfire, speeches about freedom, family, and fighting a corrupt civilization were not just rhetoric to Arthur. They were a philosophy, a story of how the poor and unwanted could be the living embodiment of resistance in the truest sense. For years, the gang's robberies had a logic, at least in Arthur's memory. Banks, railroads, rich men who would not be missed. The gang might spill blood, but Dutch always claimed it was necessary, always claimed it was controlled. Blackwater shatters that illusion. A ferry full of civilians, a dead girl named Heidi McCourt, Pinkertons already waiting, gang members gunned down in the chaos. None of it fits the story Dutch had told from the very beginning. Where is the noble rebellion in a botched escape that leaves Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender dying in the snow? In the early chapters of Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur moves through Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook as a man holding two truths in a single, tightening fist. Dutch saved him. Dutch may have finally lost his way. The game rarely has him say this aloud, but it lives in the tension between his words and his eyes. He defends Dutch around the campfire, mocks doubters, insists that the plan will work, yet his gaze lingers on Hosea's doubts and John's scars. Loyalty and betrayal, dreams and delusions, freedom and civilization, Arthur is caught between them. His journal makes that conflict painfully clear. In his cramped handwriting, Arthur circles Blackwater without quite naming it, returning again and again to the dead, and to Dutch's insistence that it was all a tragic accident. He sketches the mountains around Coulter, the wagons buried in snow, the faces of those lost, and wonders whether the world was changing faster than Dutch could admit. When he writes about Davy dying slow in the cold, there is anger there, but it has no safe target yet. So Blackwater becomes an unspoken wound at the center of Arthur's faith. He does not confront Dutch directly. He cannot. Not yet. Instead, he doubles down on work, on enforcing camp rules, on playing the role of loyal lieutenant who keeps the family together while the old ways were dying around them. Every job after, every promise of one last score, is colored by that first great failure he refuses to look at straight on. The question is not whether the crack exists. It is how long Dutch's voice can drown out the sound of it widening. But that crack in Dutch's authority is not just an abstract doubt in Arthur's mind. It has a face, a name, and a scar. It is John Marston, the man who ran and then came back. John is in Blackwater from the very beginning. He is not a distant legend or a man who conveniently missed the worst of it. He is on that ferry when the plan, sold as simple and clean, explodes into chaos. In the smoke and screaming as Heidi McCourt falls and Pinkertons surge from the shadows, John is separated from Arthur and Dutch, shot and thrown from the fight into the dark water and the brush beyond the docks. He does not die, he crawls. Wounded, half-conscious, hunted through a world that has suddenly decided this outlaw family is public enemy number one. The gang flees north, dragging the wounded Davy Callender toward the snow, leaving Blackwater locked down behind them with snipers on the roofs and wanted posters on every wall. Somewhere in that brutal transition, John disappears. No note, no body, no heroic last stand, just absence. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, that absence cuts deeper than a bullet. Dutch, who has built his philosophy on never leaving anyone behind, feels it as the worst possible insult. While Jenny Kirk dies on the trail and Davy succumbs in the storm, Dutch convinces himself that John chose self-preservation over family. The man he once called a son becomes, in the truest sense, a symbol of abandonment at the moment Dutch most needed proof that his way still meant something. When John finally staggers back into camp at Coulter, half frozen and apologetic, the damage is already done. The reunion is not a triumphant return of a lost soul, but an awkward negotiation. Dutch embraces him, yet the embrace has conditions. Javier defends him, Bill grumbles, and Arthur, who never left Dutch's side through Blackwater, watches with a mixture of relief and resentment. Who really paid the price for staying? Who will pay the price for running? John's guilt over that choice becomes its own quiet engine. He throws himself into work, into danger, into proving that he still belongs. Arthur does the same, but for the opposite reason, trying to uphold a code that is slipping away. Their paths run parallel, two surrogate sons competing for the approval of a father whose judgment is no longer sound. One stayed and doubts. One ran and regrets. Both are trapped. This fracture does not heal with time. It hardens. By the era of civilization seen in Red Dead Redemption, when the world was changing and the old ways were dying outright, the government forces John to hunt down the remnants of his past. Dutch is not just another target. He is the living embodiment of a man who never forgave him for Blackwater. Every step John takes toward Dutch's final stand is haunted by that first step he took away from the ferry, turning a government ultimatum into the closing chapter of a family tragedy that began on the docks of Blackwater. And Dutch is not the only ghost Blackwater leaves behind. In the shadows of that ferry, another figure steps forward, not as a victim of the massacre, but as its greatest beneficiary, Micah Bell. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had been a story of long-earned loyalty. Dutch and Hosea, Arthur and John, men and women who had bled together over decades. Micah is the exception. He drifts in late, a seasoned outlaw with a cruel streak, a man without history in this family yet suddenly positioned at the very heart of its future. Before Blackwater, he is just another gun. After Blackwater, he becomes the loudest voice at Dutch's shoulder. The massacre gives him his opening. In the snow at Coulter, when everyone is cold, starving, and terrified. Micah is the one who refuses to question Dutch's philosophy. While Hosea urges caution and Arthur quietly wonders what went wrong on that ferry, Micah bellows that nothing was wrong with the plan at all. The problem, he insists, was the world. The law. The Pinkertons. Civilization closing in with rifles already trained on the gang before they even drew their weapons. Micah begins to rewrite Blackwater in real time. In his version, Dutch is the living embodiment of resistance, ambushed by cowards hiding behind badges and bank ledgers. The dead civilians, Heidi McCourt, the chaos on the docks, the bodies left in the water become proof, not of Dutch's miscalculation, but of the state's brutality. If someone hesitates, Micah has an answer. The law was waiting. The Pinkertons were tipped off. Some rich parasite in Blackwater sold them out. Anyone's fault but Dutch's. This is flattery in the truest sense, because it does not sound like flattery. It sounds like shared rage. Dutch, reeling from failure, grieving Jenny and Davy, feels his dreams slipping away. Micah offers him not comfort, but a new story, that Dutch was right, that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and only greater violence can keep their freedom alive. Who becomes more valuable in that moment, the friend who questions, or the newcomer who sanctifies every decision? As camp moves from Coulter to Horseshoe Overlook and beyond, that question answers itself. Hosea's quiet doubts begin to sound old, even defeatist. Arthur's skepticism feels like betrayal. Micah, by contrast, is pure affirmation. He calls Dutch brother, urges bolder robberies, mocks any hint of retreat. His loyalty is not to Dutch's original, idealistic dream of family and justice. It is to Dutch's wounded pride. Blackwater gives Micah leverage. He alone promises that the massacre proves Dutch must double down, not reconsider. He pushes the gang toward darker ground, more blood, fewer questions, a philosophy hollowed out and replaced by appetite. And as Dutch leans on Micah more and more, a new question begins to haunt the camp. Who is really leading whom? For Hosea Matthews, Blackwater is not just a disaster. It is the moment he realizes the story he helped write has slipped out of his hands. From the very beginning, Dutch and Hosea stood side by side as partners, not leader and follower. Two rival conmen who tried to rob each other and ended up building a philosophy together. A story of freedom and family that turned a ragged band of misfits into something larger than crime. Dutch gave the speeches, but Hosea built the plans. Dutch dreamed of resisting civilization. Hosea made sure they survived long enough to pretend they were winning. Hosea's creed was simple in the truest sense. Think first, bleed last. Rob the rich, avoid slaughter, never gamble the entire family on one roll of the dice. From its humble beginnings, the gang's success came from patience, scouting, and knowing when to walk away. Blackwater is the exact opposite. A crowded town, a ferry full of civilians, a law presence that feels too heavy, too ready. To Hosea, this is not a righteous strike against a corrupt world. It is a trap waiting to be sprung. When the ambush comes and the ferry turns into a killing ground, every principle Hosea believed in is violated at once. Heidi McCourt dies screaming on the deck, Jenny and Davy fall in the chaos of the escape, and the Pinkertons close in with a precision that reeks of betrayal. This is not the clean robbery he argued for. This is slaughter, panic, and improvisation. The old ways were dying, and Dutch chose to pretend they were not. In the freezing aftermath at Coulter, Hosea's doubt never explodes into open rebellion. It settles in his shoulders, in the way his voice softens when he talks to Arthur, in the way he keeps circling Dutch with gentle questions. He tries to steer the gang back towards smaller jobs, safer towns, the kind of work that once kept them fed without turning them into the monsters the Blackwater newspapers describe. He worries about Arthur's loyalty being twisted, about Micah whispering poison into Dutch's ear. He knows Arthur is not just a gun. He is the living embodiment of the gang's soul, and that soul is being pulled in two directions. Hosea sees what Blackwater truly means long before the others. The Pinkertons are not just hunting an outlaw family, they are hunting an idea, a philosophy that no longer fits the world that is coming. The world was changing, and Dutch's response is not adaptation, but delusion. Hosea understands that once Dutch chose massacre over retreat, there was no easy road back. That is what makes Hosea the most tragic figure in this chapter. He grasps the scale of the damage, feels the future closing in, and still cannot stop the momentum. He keeps planning, keeps calming, keeps hoping Dutch will listen one more time. But the man he once followed as an equal is already slipping away, and Blackwater is the first proof that Hosea's quiet wisdom may no longer be enough. The question is no longer whether the gang can escape the law. It is whether anyone inside that camp can escape Dutch's unraveling dream. Blackwater becomes Dutch's scripture. From that day on, every campfire speech, every wild promise, every reckless plan is preached through the smoke of that ferry and the bodies it left behind. Before Blackwater, his words had a different weight. He spoke of freedom and family, of finding a place beyond the reach of civilization where an outlaw could be, in the truest sense, more honest than the banker and the politician. Around Coulter's frozen fires, Arthur remembers Dutch talking about Tahiti, about living off the land, about a story of men and women who refused to kneel to a rigged world. The violence was always there, but it was dressed in philosophy, wrapped in dreams. After Blackwater, the tone changes. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch no longer wants to escape that world. He wants to hurt it. His speeches grow darker, sharper, built on betrayal rather than hope. He reminds the gang of Jenny and Davy freezing on the mountain, of Heidi McCourt lying dead on that ferry, and insists those deaths were not the price of their choices, but the proof of a conspiracy. They are no longer outlaws by choice. They are victims of a corrupt system that must be punished. This is Dutch's new gospel. Blackwater becomes the origin myth he repeats to justify every escalation. When Hosea questions the wisdom of robbing the bank in St. Denis, Dutch cuts him off with a familiar refrain. They were betrayed in Blackwater. They cannot go back. There is no honest life left. When Arthur worries about Micah's influence, Dutch turns the memory of that massacre into a shield, accusing Arthur of forgetting the dead, of losing faith in the family that bled on that dock. He does it again at Beaver Hollow. Surrounded by sickness and hunger, with Pinkertons closing in, Dutch invokes Blackwater every time someone hesitates. John wants to leave? John ran at Blackwater. Arthur doubts him? Arthur is listening to the same kind of men who set them up on that ferry. The dead become a chorus that only Dutch can hear, and he speaks for them to silence the living. Who can argue with a martyr they helped bury? In that sense, Blackwater does not simply break Dutch. It liberates him from the last restraints of his own philosophy. From its humble beginnings, his creed had always balanced freedom against responsibility, rebellion against some notion of honor. Now, in his mind, honor is owed only to the fallen, and loyalty means obedience to the man who claims to avenge them. By the time Dutch strides through Guarma's jungle and into the swamps of Lemoyne, he is the living embodiment of his own worst fears. A paranoid warlord convinced that every setback is treachery and every doubt is betrayal. The massacre gives him permission to become this man, and he seizes it with both hands. The tragedy is that the gang keeps listening, even as the sermons grow bloodier. Because if Blackwater was not a noble sacrifice, if it was just a terrible mistake, then what has all this suffering been for? But the world does not let them pretend for long. Blackwater does not stay a single night of gunfire and panic on a ferry. It becomes a permanent price on their heads. A number written in ink and blood that follows them from the snow in Coulter to the swamps of Lemoyne. From the very beginning, the scale is unprecedented. The state of West Elizabeth posts an enormous bounty on Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, John, and the rest. A figure so high it turns the gang from troublesome outlaws into the living embodiment of public enemy. Newspapers in Blackwater describe them as butchers of innocence, the murderers of Heidi McCourt, the scourge of a civilized town. That story spreads by rail, by telegraph, by rumor, until every baroom and sheriff's office knows their faces before they ever ride in. This is not a local problem that can be ridden away from. It is a story of a crime that civilization refuses to forget. The bounty means that in Valentine, in Rhodes, even in distant Annisburg, every drunk with a gun and every deputy with ambition sees the Van der Linde gang as a walking payday. A stranger on the road might be a farmer, or he might be a man who has just read a wanted poster and decided that loyalty is worth less than a sack of government dollars. Under that pressure, the gang's choices grow narrower and darker. Honest work will not pay off a bounty that large. Small robberies will not buy enough time. Dutch's philosophy, already shaking, mutates into a desperate calculus: bigger scores, riskier banks, more dangerous allies. The move from Horseshoe Overlook to Clemens Point, from Clemens Point to Shady Bell, from Shady Bell to Beaver Hollow, is not just a change of scenery. It is a retreat into the margins, into places where the law hesitates to follow, and only the most lost soul would willingly live. Each new camp sits further from the railroads and deeper into the mud, the mosquitoes, the cold. The old ways were dying, and the gang feels it in the way lawmen appear faster, in how Pinkerton agents cross states with ease, and how the bounty never shrinks no matter how far they ride. The more they run, the higher the price climbs, and the higher it climbs, the more they must run. It is a perfect trap. The Pinkertons turn that bounty into a mandate. Milton and Ross are not chasing a single botched job. They are enforcing a sentence handed down by a modernizing world. Telegraphs carry sightings in minutes. Railroads deliver agents to the edge of camp. Government bonds from the ferry tie the massacre directly to federal interests. Blackwater gives the Bureau of Investigation and the Pinkertons a reason to hound this one gang above all others, to turn Dutch's family into a case study in how the frontier will be tamed. For Arthur, for John, for Javier and Bill, the massacre stops being a memory and becomes a constant presence. It dictates when they can move, where they can sleep, who they dare to trust. A simple trip into town for medicine or ammunition becomes a negotiation with fate, one wrong word to the wrong shopkeeper. And suddenly half the county is chasing them for a reward that could buy a new life. How long can a family survive when the entire world is paid to tear it apart? In the truest sense, the bounty is Dutch's shadow. It grows whenever he refuses to turn back, whenever he chooses another scheme instead of surrender. And as that shadow stretches, it will pull them toward men and places far more dangerous than any Pinkerton badge, setting up the alliances that finally break the gang beyond repair. That shadow does not just hang over the gang's future plans. It seeps into their memories, into the very way they talk about where it all went wrong. Around the campfire, Blackwater stops being a single bloody morning on a ferry and becomes a story of betrayal, of lost fortune, of a world that turned on them without warning. From its humble beginnings as a simple job, the tale mutates each time it is told. Bill and Javier lean on the law's treachery, swearing the Pinkertons were hiding on that dock long before Dutch pulled the trigger on Heidi McCourt. To them, Blackwater proves everything Dutch ever said about civilization: the rich in their fine suits, the detectives in their polished boots, all waiting to gun down an outlaw family that only wanted a fair shake. Others, quieter and more haunted, remember different details. Karen mutters about Jenny Kirk, dead in the snow because the ferry went bad. The name Davy Callender hangs in the air like smoke no one wants to acknowledge for too long. For some, the wound is measured in bodies. For others, it is counted in dollars. Uncle grumbles about the money left behind, the cash and bonds that were supposed to buy their freedom, sitting in a Blackwater vault guarded by men who did not earn it. Micah sharpens the point, turning it into a philosophy of his own. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Blackwater proves that hesitation is death. In his version, they should have fought harder, shot faster, trusted Dutch more and everyone else less. This selective memory is not an accident. It is survival. If the gang ever sat together and spoke plainly about the girl on the ferry, about Dutch firing in a panic, about how someone must have talked to Angelo Bronte's friends in town long before the job, what would be left of the dream? Better to choose a villain, polish a grievance, and keep riding. The story becomes a shield, and also a blindfold. Arthur feels that blindfold tightening. Each retelling grates against the fragments he cannot forget. Davy coughing his lungs out in the wagon, Jenny slipping away between camps, John half dead in the snow because the escape from Blackwater scattered them to the wind. Dutch and Micah speak of destiny and betrayal. Arthur remembers confusion and fear. The gap between the legend and the reality widens, and in that gap, his faith begins to fall. In the truest sense, understanding Blackwater means understanding why this family is already doomed. The job itself, the ambush on the docks, the dead civilians and dead friends, is only half the disaster. The other half is the story they choose to tell about it, the myth that excuses Dutch, empowers Micah, and keeps every lost soul in camp chasing ghosts. The question is not just what happened in Blackwater. The question is who is still lying about it when the snow begins to melt. For Dutch, the worst part of Blackwater is not the blood on the docks. It is the money in the water. From the very beginning, the story of the massacre is also a story of a fortune that never quite exists in one place at one time. A phantom pile of cash and bonds that everyone talks about and no one can ever touch. The scale of that fortune matters. In campfire conversations, Dutch and Hosea speak of Blackwater as the score that would have ended it all. A haul big enough to buy land, security, maybe even a future beyond the outlaw world. John later tells Abigail in the epilogue that Dutch left all that money there, and the way he says it carries the weight of a man who knows they walked away from tens of thousands, not a few unlucky dollars. Bonds, not just banknotes, were on that ferry, the kind of paper that could transform an idealistic dream into permanent escape. The known facts are simple and devastating. The gang hits the ferry. Heidi McCourt dies in Dutch's hands. The Pinkertons close in faster than anyone expected. In the chaos on the docks, some loot is grabbed, some is dropped, and the rest is hastily hidden. The survivors flee north, dragging wounded men through snow while Dutch insists that a boatload of money still waits back near Blackwater, buried in a satchel or sunk in the lake. The game's locked-down waterfront, the bounties, the snipers on the cliffs, all silently confirm that the law believes that treasure is real too. From there, the theories multiply. One reading is almost painfully straightforward. Dutch stashes the money in the confusion, planning to return once the heat dies down. In this version, the missing fortune becomes the living embodiment of his philosophy, proof that his grand plan still exists somewhere, if he can only keep the family together long enough to reclaim it. Another theory turns the knife toward Micah. He appears in the gang just before Blackwater, grows close to Dutch with suspicious speed, and always seems to know more than he should. Did he skim a portion, tip the Pinkertons, or both? A third possibility points outward, towards civilization itself. Perhaps the Pinkertons and Blackwater's elite quietly seized more than the newspapers admit, folding outlaw dreams into respectable ledgers. Whatever the truth, the vanishing money stops being mere loot and becomes a curse. Dutch invokes it in Coulter, in Horseshoe Overlook, in St. Denis, always promising that one more risk, one more betrayal, will finally bring the gang back to that lost payday. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, all condensed into a single missing satchel. Each time Dutch fails, the money grows more mythical, more distant, until it is no longer about dollars at all. It is about pride. It is about a man who cannot admit that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that the future he promised may have drowned in Blackwater before the snow even fell. The question then becomes unavoidable. If the fortune is gone, what exactly is everyone still dying for? The answer, for Blackwater, is simple. Survival, not of one man or one gang, but of a new order that refuses to risk its future on the whims of outlaws. Before the massacre, Blackwater is the living embodiment of that future. Electric lights burn through the night where once only lanterns flickered. Paved streets cut clean lines through the mud of the old frontier. Steamboats slide in and out of the harbor, hauling people, cattle, and capital, binding this remote shore to the wider world. It is a story of progress and profit, of freedom measured not in open plains, but in contracts, timetables, and bank accounts. From its humble beginnings as a rough river landing, Blackwater has become a promise that civilization can finally tame the West. The telegraph wires hum, brick buildings rise. Respectable families stroll past gentlemen in tailored suits, and the outlaw West feels distant, almost quaint. Dutch looks at this town and sees betrayal of everything he claims to stand for. The town looks at Dutch and sees a threat to everything it has built. Then the ferry job goes wrong, and overnight, that polished fade hardens into a fortress. The very beginning of the new century is baptized in gunfire. Pinkertons entrench themselves along the docks where tourists once disembarked, rifles resting where porters used to carry trunks. Patrols ride the roads leading north and east, stopping coaches, checking faces, turning the open country into a net. Wanted posters bearing Dutch, Arthur, and John's names bloom on every wall, a grim harvest of paper and ink. Blackwater seals itself, not in name, but in practice. Anyone suspected of ties to the Van der Linde gang is questioned, shadowed, or quietly disappeared. The docks that welcomed fortune seekers now repel them with watchful eyes and ready guns. Is this still a town, or has it become a garrison with storefronts? In the truest sense, the game makes that question literal. For Arthur, Blackwater becomes an invisible wall carved into the map. Cross the river in the early chapters, and the response is instant and lethal. Lawmen and bounty hunters materialize with uncanny speed, bullets answering curiosity. High bounties stack up almost at once. Snipers on the ridges and rooftops turn exploration into suicide. The world remembers the massacre, even if the player never sees it. The town itself rejects the gang, as if the land has taken sides. That fortified Blackwater becomes a symbol of the age closing in. The future is no longer an abstract fear in Dutch's philosophy. It stands on the shore with badges, ledgers, and repeating rifles. Organized, funded, and patient. The old ways were dying, and this is how they die. Not in a fair gunfight on an open street, but behind barricades and legal documents, under the watch of men who answer to corporations and politicians rather than sheriffs. For an outlaw world built on dreams of freedom and open horizons, Blackwater on lockdown is the verdict. There is no going back, only forward, into a country where every road is watched, every dollar is counted, and every lost soul who refuses to bow is marked for erasure. The gang rides away from that verdict into the snow, but Blackwater does not fade behind them. Its lights keep burning, its guns stay loaded, and its memory will chase them from camp to camp, until even their family turns on itself in the shadow of that fortified town. Blackwater becomes more than a town on a map. It becomes a headline, a warning, a story of what happens when the old ways were dying and refused to lie down quietly. The gang rides into the snow as fugitives, but on the printed page they are transformed into something far more terrifying. The wanted posters go up first. In the very beginning, Dutch van der Linde's name had been tied to robbery, to train holdups and bank jobs, to the romantic image of an outlaw who stole from railroads and rich men. After Blackwater, the ink changes. Robber gives way to butcher. Gang leader becomes mass murderer. The reward on Dutch's head balloons to an unprecedented figure, outstripping even the most notorious gangs in the region's lore. The posters do not describe a man with a philosophy of freedom and family. They describe a monster. Newspapers follow, and they are merciless. Columns linger on Heidi McCourt's death, repeating her name, her age, her supposed innocence, until she becomes the living embodiment of everything civilization claims to protect. A single girl on a ferry becomes the face of the Blackwater Massacre. Reports speak of civilians gunned down, of panicked passengers trampled or shot in the confusion. Was every account accurate? That no longer matters. The narrative is set, and repetition makes it truth. Compared to other criminals mentioned in the papers, the Van der Linde gang is framed as something closer to a rogue army than a band of thieves. The Pinkertons justify an enormous manhunt by pointing to those headlines: women and children endangered, federal property stolen, a town traumatized. The bounty is not just money on a poster, it is a political statement. It tells the public that Dutch is no longer an eccentric bandit out on the margins, but a war criminal in the truest sense. An enemy of the emerging order that must be hunted across every state line. In this official story, nuance dies alongside Heidi. Dutch's earlier restraint, his refusal to kill needlessly, his talk of sparing innocence when possible, all vanish beneath that one word: massacre. From its humble beginnings, the gang had traded on whispers of being Robin Hood bandits, robbing the powerful to keep a fragile dream of freedom alive in the woods and mountains. Now those old tales are buried, replaced by a single bloody episode that defines them forever. This public rewriting of events becomes a new kind of prison. With posters in every post office, and Pinkertons quoting newspaper editorials as justification, there is no room left to negotiate, to disappear quietly, to reinvent themselves as drifters or ranch hands. The world was changing, and it had decided who they were. Every town they enter now has read about them. Every lawman has an excuse to shoot first. Even those who might have once admired Dutch's rhetoric see only the price on his head. Trapped in that image, the gang begins to live up to it. When civilization calls them monsters, what choices remain? The answer will shape every camp that follows, and every betrayal still to come. Blackwater brands the gang as monsters. But for John Marston, that night does something even harsher. It turns the man he called father into the man who left him to die. In the truest sense, this is where John's redemption begins. Even as the rest of the world only sees a massacre on a ferry. Reconstructing John's role means reading between the gunshots. Dutch talks about a simple job: bonds and cash on a ferry, a quick strike before civilization could blink. John, one of Dutch's best guns, would not have been guarding wagons in the rear. He was almost certainly on that boat, close to the vaults and the passengers, part of the first wave that forced the crew and the rich to the floor. Somewhere in that chaos, as Heidi McCourt is shot and the Pinkertons spring their ambush, John is hit. A bullet tears into him, probably as he fights toward the gang's escape route, and the clean plan collapses into smoke, screaming, and blood. The gang scatters. Arthur later insists there was no chance to go back. Dutch claims there was no way to know who had fallen, yet John's own bitter summary, years later, is simple. He was shot, and they left him. Wounded and disoriented on the banks outside Blackwater, he becomes a story of raw survival. No horses, no friendly faces, no campfire waiting just over the ridge. Just mud, pain, and the slow realization that the family he bled for is gone. He crawls. Maybe he drags himself through reeds along the shoreline, avoiding the lanterns of searching lawmen. Maybe he lies still as dogs bark in the distance, forcing his breath quiet while the world was changing around him. The old ways were dying, and here is one outlaw, half dead in the dark, learning that the gang's famous loyalty has limits. For at least one endless night, John believes Dutch chose the money and the living over the wounded son left behind. That belief does not vanish when he limps back into their orbit. At Coulter, at Horseshoe Overlook, John plays the loyal lieutenant, but something fundamental has shifted. Abigail and Jack are no longer just part of the gang's extended family. They are the center of his world. Every reckless scheme, every desperate speech from Dutch, rubs against the memory of cold ground and abandoned blood. A seed of doubt is planted, and each failure waters it. So when the government finally corners him in Red Dead Redemption, John already carries Blackwater in his bones. Dutch once saved him from a noose, raised him from his humble beginnings as a lost soul into the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. But Dutch also walked away on that riverbank. Is it betrayal to hunt such a man, or the inevitable end of a story built on broken promises? That question will drive John back toward the mountains, back toward Dutch, and back to the night that truly broke him. For John, Blackwater is the night Dutch finally breaks. For Arthur, it is the night that never quite comes into focus, a story of blood and chaos that he circles in conversation but almost never enters. He calls it that mess in Blackwater, that disaster, when it all went wrong, as if naming it too clearly might drag the whole memory up from the dark. From the very beginning of the game, Blackwater hangs over him as both fact and absence. Pinkertons spit the word like a curse, townsfolk talk about a massacre, but Arthur's own tongue stays careful. When pressed, he summarizes, deflects, moves on. Is that the practiced silence of an outlaw protecting his family, or the half-conscious repression of a man who cannot bear to replay every scream on that ferry? The world was changing, and Arthur's language around Blackwater feels like a man trying not to admit how far he let himself be carried by that change. Yet the fragments that do surface are telling. Arthur covers the retreat in the snow, dragging wounded men through the blizzard after the ferry job goes bad. He tries to help Davy Callender, who dies slowly in Coulter, and he remembers Jenny Kirk, lost somewhere between the gunfire and the mountains. He mentions Dutch shooting a girl, Heidi McCourt, on the boat, a civilian killed in cold blood as the plan collapses. Arthur does not boast about any of this. He states it, flat and heavy, as if reading charges from his own indictment. In the truest sense, his guilt is not centered on a single pull of the trigger. It is centered on obedience. He followed Dutch onto that ferry. He followed Dutch off it. Even after the Pinkertons were waiting, even after Dutch killed an innocent girl, Arthur still rode into the mountains believing, still told himself this was an aberration, not a revelation. That is the wound he cannot quite look at, not merely what Dutch did, but that Arthur stayed. Blackwater becomes the silent weight in every later choice. When Arthur spares a debtor, questions a robbery, or steps between Dutch and another doomed plan, the shadow of that unseen night is there. Each small act of mercy feels less random and more like a man trying to row against the current of his own history, to prove that the loyal enforcer can become something other than the living embodiment of Dutch's worst impulses. The old ways were dying, and Arthur's conscience was one of the few things in the gang that refused to die with them. So the game never lets him ride back into Blackwater, never grants him a clean confrontation with the scene of the crime. Instead, it lets the town exist just out of reach, ringed with rifles and bounties, a locked door he carries inside himself. The real reckoning will not come from revisiting the docks. It will come when Arthur finally admits that the massacre he cannot remember clearly is the one he has been trying to atone for ever since. That quiet confession in the snow opens the door to a darker question. If Blackwater shattered Arthur, what did it awaken in Micah Bell? The massacre does not only haunt the men who doubt Dutch, it also empowers the man who never truly did. Before Blackwater, Micah is loud, crude, and dangerous, but he is not yet the living embodiment of Dutch's will. He drifts into the gang late, a gun for hire who tells stories about robbing a stage in 1898, boasting more than belonging. Around the fire, longtime members measure him against the old guard, Hosea with his weary wisdom, Arthur with his heavy loyalty, John with his stubborn pride. These are the pillars from its humble beginnings. Micah is a new arrival on the edge of the circle, useful steel rather than trusted family. The ferry changes that. In a single night, the gang's carefully balanced world is torn open. Jenny Kirk, who had survived so many winters with them, dies off screen in the desperate flight from Blackwater. Davy Callender, shot and bleeding, barely makes it to Coulter before he dies in the snow. John is wounded and lost in the blizzard, his absence felt not just as a missing gun, but as a missing son. For Dutch, already reeling from the image of Heidi McCourt dead on the deck, this is more than a botched job. It is a story of failure, of family slipping through his fingers. Into that vacuum steps Micah. In the truest sense, he offers Dutch something no one else can at that moment, unflinching affirmation. While Hosea questions the wisdom of going back, while Arthur quietly worries about the women and children freezing in the mountains, Micah urges movement, aggression, retaliation. Dutch needs to believe he is still strong, still right, still the man who can bend civilization to his philosophy. Micah feeds that need with every word. In the early chapters, this pattern hardens. At Coulter, at Horseshoe Overlook, at Clemens Point, Micah stands at Dutch's shoulder, always volunteering for the bloodiest work, always pushing for the boldest robberies. When Dutch wants to hit the Cornwall train, Micah is there, praising the plan while others hesitate. When someone suggests lying low, he mocks them as timid, uncommitted to the dream of freedom. Is it any surprise that Dutch starts hearing Micah's voice more clearly than Hosea's warnings? The old ways were dying inside the gang, long before the world finished them off. Every time Dutch chooses Micah's flattery over Hosea's caution, every time Arthur's doubts are met with Micah's sneers, the center of gravity shifts. What began as an idealistic outlaw family becomes a vehicle for Dutch's wounded ego, and Micah is the engine driving it forward. Without the trauma and paranoia of that night in Blackwater, would Dutch ever have needed a man like Micah? Without the image of friends dying in the snow and Pinkertons on every horizon, would he have listened so closely to his worst instincts, dressed up as courage? The answer echoes through every camp the gang builds afterward, and the next move Micah convinces Dutch to make will drag them into a new kind of war. The Blackwater disaster does more than kill people. It kills an idea. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang has survived on a story it tells about itself, a story of freedom and honor in a world gone rotten, and Blackwater is the moment that story stops matching the blood on the ground. Dutch's creed, before that ferry, is almost a creed of chivalry. Rob from the rich, never from the poor. Avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Protect women and children. Strike fast, disappear faster, and stay one step ahead of the law rather than declare war on civilization itself. In Dutch's mind, the gang is not just a band of thieves, it is the living embodiment of resistance, an idealistic family proving that the old ways were dying for the wrong reasons. From the very beginning, he insists there is a difference between his people and the O'Driscolls, between rebellion and cruelty. Hosea tempers the philosophy with pragmatism, Arthur enforces it with his gun, and even hard men like Bill and Javier repeat the code around the campfire. They are outlaws, yes, but in the truest sense, they imagine themselves as principled predators in a corrupt world, not butchers. Then Blackwater happens. A ferry full of civilians, a town already on edge, Pinkertons waiting before the gang even draws its guns. When the smoke clears, Heidi McCourt lies dead, a young woman shot on that ferry, and the newspapers do not print Dutch's speeches about freedom. They print the names of the dead. To the people of Blackwater, this is not a bold strike against the powerful. It is a massacre. The town locks down under armed patrols and snipers, bounty posters scream for Van der Linde blood, and whispered stories turn the gang into monsters. Civilians remember screams, not slogans. Doors stay barred. Mothers pull children off the street when strangers ride past. From the outside, it looks less like a noble stand and more like senseless slaughter. This is the moment a different man might step back and ask what went wrong. Dutch does the opposite. He cannot admit that his philosophy led here, so he insists the world forced his hand. The law was waiting. The rich and powerful conspired. Bronte and the bankers and the Pinkertons turned a simple job into a war. Therefore, the answer, in his mind, is not to change course, but to hit back harder. Fight more, trust less, yield never. That becomes the new unspoken code. Inside the gang, the fracture is slow, but it is real. Some cling to the old myth, repeating Dutch's words as if repetition can make them true. Others, Arthur, John, even Hosea in his quiet moments, start to see the gap between the story and the reality. They watch Jenny and Davy die in the snow, remember Heidi on the ferry, and recognize a terrible truth. They are becoming exactly what they once claimed to oppose. But who dares say that out loud, with Dutch listening, and Micah whispering war into his ear? The silence after Blackwater does not last. It curdles into something sharper, something organized. On one side, a gang drifting toward delusion. On the other, two men who decide that Dutch Van der Linde is no longer a troublesome outlaw, but a problem to be solved. Andrew Milton and Edgar Ross enter the story here as more than just names on government letters. Milton is the old breed of Pinkerton, blunt, methodical, convinced that civilization advances on the barrel of a gun. Ross is the new breed, ambitious, calculating, already dreaming of a world where men like Dutch are trophies for a rising federal state. Blackwater hands them exactly what they need. A dead girl on a ferry, bodies in the water, civilians caught in the crossfire. From the very beginning, they can point to a massacre and say, with cold certainty, that Dutch is beyond negotiation. Before Blackwater, the Van der Linde gang is an irritation, a regional headache wrapped in romantic rumors. After Blackwater, it becomes a headline, a scandal, a story of lawlessness that makes politicians nervous. The world was changing, and nervous politicians pay well for order. The sheer scale of the violence lets Milton and Ross walk into offices in Blackwater, St. Denis, and Washington with ledgers of the dead and a simple argument: give us more. More funding, more men, broader authority. One gang is recast as a national threat, the living embodiment of everything progress is supposed to sweep away. That shift is felt in every chapter of Red Dead Redemption 2. The Pinkertons are no longer content to trail the gang at a distance. They harass the camp at Horseshoe Overlook, pressuring Leopold Strauss's debtors, sniffing around Abigail and Jack. At Clemens Point, they close in through Hosea's failed negotiations and Cornwall's private army. At Shady Belle, they raid outright, driving the gang from its last comfortable home. By Beaver Hollow, the pursuit has become relentless. Surprise assaults in the woods, agents on riverboats, Milton appearing at the worst possible moments, as if summoned by Dutch's own paranoia. For Milton, Dutch is no longer a man who can be reasoned with. He is a contagion. Each time he confronts Arthur, there is that same cold insistence: this is over, this is inevitable, this is in the truest sense a cleanup operation. Freedom, family, philosophy, those are dismissed as excuses for slaughter. And Ross watches, learning, taking notes on how fear and public outrage can be turned into a career. Blackwater does not just reshape one pursuit, it reshapes the entire West. The old ways were dying, but the massacre lets men like Ross accelerate the funeral. The aggressive tactics used against Dutch become the template for a wider crackdown, more bounties, faster hangings. Whole towns turning on any drifter who looks wrong. By the time John Marston rides in Red Dead Redemption, Milton's war has become Ross's doctrine. Outlaws are no longer tragic figures on the edge of the world. They are targets on a checklist. And yet, for all that power, there is still one thing the Pinkertons cannot control: what Blackwater does to the gang's soul. What Blackwater does to the gang's soul begins long before a single shot is fired. It begins in drawing rooms and cigar smoke, in quiet conversations between men who never have to pull a trigger themselves. It begins with Angelo Bronte's shadow. By the time the Van der Linde gang reaches St. Denis, Bronte is the living embodiment of the new order. A crime lord in the truest sense, he does not hide from civilization. He owns a piece of it. He dines with mayors, whispers to bankers, and trades favors with lawmen. He runs rackets, extorts businessmen, and manipulates elections, all while presenting himself as a patron of culture and charity. Where Dutch talks about freedom from its humble beginnings as an idealistic dream, Bronte talks about control. This is the key difference. Dutch wages war on the system. Bronte uses the system as his weapon. When Dutch robs a bank, he sees philosophy and rebellion. When Bronte moves money, he sees leverage and futures. So when the gang later discovers how quickly the Pinkertons descended on that Blackwater ferry, a question lingers beneath every campfire argument and whispered accusation: who else thinks like Bronte in this world? The theory that men in Bronte's mold help set the stage in Blackwater is not just wild paranoia. Consider the timing. The ferry is supposed to be a simple score: cash, bonds, a clean escape before dawn. Instead, the law is already in position, not scrambling, not surprised, but waiting. Snipers, patrols, coordinated pressure that forces Dutch into that fatal moment with Heidi McCourt. That kind of precision does not come from a last-minute tip from some panicked deputy. It feels planned. It feels purchased. Blackwater is not a backwater frontier town. It is polished streets, busy docks, and investors dreaming of railroads and oil. A gang that blows up safes, kills civilians, and scares away capital is bad for business. So imagine a local magnate, a banker with friends in St. Denis, or a crime boss with Bronte's card in his pocket. An outlaw gang arrives, starts asking questions about a ferry, about bonds, about security. Does that kind of man ignore it? Or does he make a quiet telegram to the Pinkertons and let the professionals clean house? After the massacre, the pattern is telling. Blackwater locks down, but its powerful citizens carry on. There are no ruined tycoons railing against Dutch in the streets, no public hand wringing from the elite. The outrage is directed at the outlaws, never at the system that put them in the crosshairs. Dutch himself cannot shake the sense of betrayal. He mutters that someone sold them out, that the job was doomed from the very beginning. His paranoia grows, but beneath it lies a colder truth. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but in Blackwater, the betrayal may not come from a single traitor in camp. It may come from a class of men who have already bought the future. And as Dutch searches for the one snake in his garden, he never quite sees the hands pulling the strings above him, not until those same hands reach out again, in Saint Denis. And yet, for an event that shatters the gang and redraws the map of their world, Blackwater is mostly spoken of as a shadow. Around the campfire, in whispered conversations and angry outbursts, it is always that mess, that job, what happened back there. It is a story of blood and betrayal that almost no one is willing to actually tell. Listen to the way they talk. Hosea grumbles that it was bad business and that Dutch lost his head. Bill snaps that the ferry was supposed to be simple. Dutch himself keeps repeating that they were robbed and betrayed, but when pressed on details, he changes the subject, turns the blame outward, or retreats into speeches about freedom and civilization. The specifics, the dead girl on the deck, the civilians caught in the crossfire, stay buried under vague, bitter phrases. That silence is not just secrecy, it is survival. Naming what really happened on that ferry would mean admitting that, in that moment, the Van der Linde gang stopped being the living embodiment of a noble outlaw philosophy and became, in the truest sense, butchers in a crowded town. Heidi McCord is never given a long eulogy in camp. Her name surfaces briefly, almost clinically, because saying it too often would force Dutch and his followers to accept that an idealistic dream of resistance now includes a murdered civilian clutching a satchel. For Arthur, for John, for Sadie, the avoidance becomes a kind of armor. Each carries a private version of Blackwater: Arthur's guilt at not stopping Dutch, John's shame at being wounded and left behind, Sadie's rage at a world that has already taken everything from her. Their memories run in parallel, never quite crossing. No one sits down to reconcile who fired first, who panicked, who saw Heidi fall. Without that shared reckoning, the gang remains a family in name, but strangers in truth. The result is a camp full of ghosts. Jenny and Davy are mentioned only in passing, as if speaking too long about the snow and the blood on the way to Coulter might crack something inside. Even Micah, who thrives on chaos, rarely recounts the details. His bravado stops just short of describing the bodies on the ferry. It is easier for everyone to blame an abstract setup than to admit that, when the shooting started, the old ways were dying inside them too. Rockstar understands the power of that gap. From its humble beginnings in the snowy prologue, the game lets Blackwater loom over every decision, yet the town itself remains off-limits, guarded by snipers and impossible bounties. The player hears rumors in saloons, reads hostile newspapers, catches fragments of conversation, but never walks the blood-stained deck or sees Heidi's final moment. Is that omission a mercy or a judgment? By refusing to fully show the massacre, the story forces the imagination to do the work, turning Blackwater into a wound that is felt in every camp move, every paranoid glance, every new betrayal still to come. Blackwater is a wound, but some of its deepest scars belong to people the story barely names. Before the ferry, before the snow, there were two quieter members of the Van der Linde family whose absence hangs over every frozen campfire at Coulter: Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender. From its humble beginnings, the gang had always been more than gun hands and sharpshooters. Jenny was a young woman taken in after a failed attempt to rob the gang, a would-be thief turned camp follower, nurse, and believer. She is remembered in passing as kind, as someone who helped tend to Arthur when he was sick, as a presence who tried to hold on to the gang's more idealistic language about freedom and fairness. Davy, by contrast, is barely present at all, mentioned only as a wounded man in the snow, yet the way the others speak his name carries the weight of shared years and quiet loyalty. The very beginning of Red Dead Redemption 2 shows the end of both their stories. As the gang flees Blackwater under Pinkerton fire, Davy is shot, mortally wounded during the chaotic escape that Dutch insists he can still control. By the time the caravan claws its way into the mountains, The living embodiment of that failed confidence is a man dying in the back of a wagon. Arthur and Dutch can do nothing except watch him fade, his death a slow echo of the sudden violence on the ferry below. Jenny's fate is even crueler. She does not die in a bedroll, surrounded by family, but is lost somewhere in the chaos around Blackwater, her body abandoned as the gang scatters and scrambles for the high country. There is no retrieval mission, no grave, no last words. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and there was simply no time. For a gang that preached loyalty above all, leaving her behind is a betrayal that is never spoken aloud, but never really goes away. What would this outlaw family have been if those two had survived? Imagine Coulter with Jenny tending the sick, pushing back against Micah's poison with a softer but stubborn faith in Dutch's better philosophy. Imagine Davy as another steady, familiar voice beside Arthur and John, someone who had grown up under Dutch and Hosea's guidance and could remember when the dream still felt pure. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, two more moderate, committed loyalists might have slowed Dutch's slide from visionary to paranoid warlord. Could Micah have isolated Dutch so easily if there were more long-standing members to counter him, to remind Dutch who he used to be? Yet their importance is felt most in negative space. The camp in the snow already feels hollow, missing people the player never properly met. Their names surface only in brief lines, then sink again, as if the gang itself cannot bear to linger on what was lost. This is, in the truest sense, a broken family from the first chapter, staggering forward with gaps in its ranks and in its heart, setting the stage for every fracture still to come. From the very beginning of the Blackwater job, Abigail Roberts stood in a place the gang barely understood, halfway between outlaw and mother, torn between loyalty to Dutch's dream and terror for the child growing up inside it. She had ridden with them for years, survived raids, winters, Pinkerton dragnets. But by 1899, every new campfire, every new town, was measured against one question in her mind. Is Jack safe here? Before Blackwater, that tension simmered quietly beneath the surface. Around Horseshoe Overlook, around the idle moments in camp, Abigail pressed John to be present, to read to Jack, to stop vanishing on long, dangerous rides with Dutch and Hosea. This was still presented as a story of domestic nagging within an outlaw family, almost mundane beside the grand speeches about freedom and civilization. Yet in those arguments, the old ways were dying. Abigail had begun to see that Dutch's philosophy of noble rebellion always demanded one more risk, one more gunfight, one more father not coming home. Then, Blackwater proved her right in the worst possible way. John rode out chasing bonds and glory and came back broken, half dead, and then, for a time, not back at all. His disappearance around the ferry job, his injuries that left him snowbound and scarred, were not heroic in Abigail's eyes. They were confirmation that Dutch's plans would eventually leave Jack with a grave instead of a parent. The massacre on that boat, the dead girl Heidi McCourt, the gang members who never made it to Coulter, became more than names. They were a vision of Jack's future if nothing changed. When John finally staggered into the freezing camp, Abigail's fear hardened into resolve. Her first words are not soft relief, but fury edged with grief. Where had he been? Why had he chosen Dutch's money over his own son? In the truest sense, Blackwater turned Abigail from reluctant accomplice into open dissenter. Each time Dutch promised that the next score would fix everything, she heard a death sentence. Each time John leaned toward Dutch's fire, she pulled him back toward the wagon where Jack slept. After Blackwater, the clashes sharpened. At Horseshoe and Clemens Point, Abigail no longer merely complained, she confronted. She demanded that John ride less for Dutch and more for Jack, that he stop chasing the fantasy of being Dutch's favored son and start acting as a father in his own right. Her arguments with Dutch and Hosea cut through the rhetoric, exposing the gap between the gang's idealistic language and the blood on their hands. She became, almost accidentally, the living embodiment of the one thing Dutch could not control, a mother who refused to sacrifice her child to his story. This pressure did not change John overnight. He still wavered, still chased the outlaw myth even as the world was changing around him. But Abigail's insistence, hammered into him from Coulter's snows to Shady Bell swamps, laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. The quiet evenings at Beecher's Hope, the strained but stubborn family in the first Red Dead Redemption, all grow out of these early ultimatums. Without Abigail's breaking point at Blackwater, John Marston might never have broken away at all. And as Dutch's leadership decays further, that domestic rebellion will matter as much as any gun drawn in the street. Blackwater does not stay in Blackwater. It echoes forward, reshaping every last job Dutch touches, turning each new town into a mirror of that one night on the ferry when the dream first sank beneath the water. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had always talked about one big score that would buy freedom from civilization. In Blackwater, that fantasy took a specific form: a modern city, a ferry loaded with cash and bonds, an inside connection through men like Angelo Bronte and the local elite. Dutch promised that if they could just pull this one off, they could disappear to some distant shore. Years later, in Saint Denis, the pattern returns almost beat for beat. Another bustling city, another supposed ally among the powerful, another carefully staged bank heist that will, in Dutch's words, finally let them leave this place forever. The structure is the same. The stakes are higher. The result is worse. Hosea and Lenny die in the street. Arthur and the survivors are driven onto rooftops, and the Pinkertons close in with the same grim inevitability that haunted Blackwater. What changes is not the plan, but Dutch. After losing the Blackwater money, he becomes the living embodiment of a gambler chasing his losses, convinced that one more hand will fix everything. Every failure is recast as a temporary setback. Every death becomes proof that the gang must push harder, take more, risk more. In the truest sense, Blackwater turns Dutch's philosophy from idealistic rebellion into compulsive repetition. He stops asking whether the dream is still possible, and starts insisting that the numbers will finally add up if he just finds a bigger score. That obsession drives him from Coulter to Rhodes, from Rhodes to Saint Denis, and finally, through catastrophe, onto the steaming shores of Guarma. Guarma seems, at first glance, to be a complete break, a foreign island, a sugar empire, a revolution between local rebels and a brutal plantation owner. Yet, it is another echo of Blackwater. Once again, Dutch inserts the gang into a conflict he barely understands, promising that if they back one side, play one more dangerous game, they will be rewarded with the money and passage that will buy their escape. How different is that from trusting Bronte's whispers in Saint Denis, or whatever arrangement brought the Pinkertons to Blackwater before the job even began? The world was changing. The old ways were dying. But Dutch cannot change with it. These repeating patterns reveal a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an outlaw leader trapped in a loop. Blackwater did not simply break him. It froze him in that moment, forever trying to rewrite a single night instead of accepting that the frontier has closed. And as the gang staggers back from Guarma into a darker, harsher America, that loop will drag everyone down with him. But Dutch is not the only thing frozen in that moment. Blackwater itself becomes a monument to a turning point, a scar on the map that powerful men can point to whenever they need proof that the old ways were dying. The massacre is not just a failure of a gang. It is a gift to those who want the frontier tamed, fenced, and sold. From the very beginning, events like Blackwater have been used as arguments, as weapons in debates about what kind of world should replace the wilderness. Lawmakers, railroad barons, and oil men do not see Jenny Kirk or Davy Callender when they read the headlines. They see leverage. They can stand in polished offices and say that merciless outlaws slaughtered innocents on a ferry, that Heidi McCourt's body is the price of hesitation, and that only faster, harsher civilization can prevent another tragedy. In that sense, the massacre becomes a story of fear turned into policy. It justifies more Pinkertons on the payroll, more federal agents on trains, more deputies riding under corporate contracts rather than dusty county sheriffs. The same companies that buy the bonds Dutch tried to steal now buy the laws that will hunt him down. Blackwater proves, in their eyes, that the West cannot be trusted with its own freedom. The world was changing long before the ferry burned, but Blackwater accelerates everything. Those iron rails cutting across the plains, the oil derricks rising over once quiet valleys, the land companies carving up ranches and tribal hunting grounds, these forces were already in motion. After the massacre, they move with a new righteousness. The men who chase Dutch through the heartlands are the same men who fence in ranchers, who push tribes onto smaller and smaller reservations, who turn small towns into way stations for capital rather than communities in the truest sense. Ordinary people feel this shift in different ways. Some are grateful. A shopkeeper in Blackwater, shaken by gunfire and rumors of bodies on the shore, welcomes the new order, even if it comes with snipers on the rooftops and patrols on every corner. A railroad worker, promised steady wages and a ticket out of poverty, does not mourn a gang he only knows from wanted posters. For them, civilization is not a philosophy, it is food on the table. But others look out at the new fences and feel something hollow. A rancher who loses open range to surveyors, a member of a displaced tribe watching rails cut through sacred ground, a drifter who never liked men like Dutch, yet still understood the dream of open horizons. These people sense that something intangible is dying. Freedom, once a landscape, is becoming a contract. Blackwater stands as a pivot, not the cause of the end, but the headline that tells the world the ending has begun. From its humble beginnings as a river town to its transformation into a fortified symbol of order, it becomes the living embodiment of a new rule. Anyone still living by the old way will not be treated as a relic, but as a monster. And as Dutch runs from that verdict, the next chapters will show just how far civilization is willing to go to prove itself right. But beneath Blackwater's new walls and watchtowers, one question refuses to stay buried. It begins on that ferry deck, in gunsmoke and screaming, with a single shot that turns a robbery into a stain on history. The facts, in the truest sense, are simple and brutal. In the chaos of the ambush, as Pinkertons close in and passengers panic, Dutch van der Linde raises his gun and kills a young civilian woman, Heidi McCourt. No bounty poster shows her face, no newspaper lingers on her name, yet her death is the pivot. The gang flees in horror, dragging wounded friends through the dark, and from that moment on, every mention of Blackwater carries the same word on its tongue: massacre. From its humble beginnings, this was supposed to be a story of daring outlaw freedom, of a gang that robbed the rich and walked away laughing. Instead, the ferry leaves behind Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender dying in the snow, Heidi McCourt dead on the deck, and a legend permanently poisoned. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. And Dutch's philosophy of noble resistance suddenly looks less noble and more murderous when a civilian girl is left among the bodies. So what really happened in that split second? One reading sees Dutch as a man finally pushed past his limit, cornered by a law that has been hunting him for years, making a mistake he can never take back. Another sees something colder, the moment when the violent core beneath his speeches finally surfaces, when the dream of family and freedom is threatened and he reveals what he is willing to sacrifice to keep it alive. Is it a tragic slip, or the mask coming off? The gang itself fractures around that question. Arthur, the loyal son, clings to the memory of the man who taught him to read and to think, yet Blackwater lodges under his skin. He defends Dutch to strangers, but in campfire silences and journal entries, doubt seeps in. Hosea, who helped build this philosophy from the very beginning, watches Dutch's justifications grow longer as the bodies pile up. His quiet looks in the aftermath say more than any argument. Something fundamental has shifted. Micah, by contrast, barely pretends to care. To him, Heidi McCourt is just another casualty, proof that the gang is finally playing for real stakes. He treats the massacre as fuel, not warning. John Marston stands somewhere between them, wounded in the escape, left behind, and then blamed for it. For John, Blackwater becomes the moment the dream of family turns into a feeling of betrayal, the first step toward walking away and letting the world call Dutch a monster. Rockstar never fully resolves this. It withholds the scene, scatters fragments in dialogue and rumor, and refuses to grant a clean answer. Because in the end, whether Dutch meant to cross that line matters less than the reality that he did, and from that night on, every soul around him has to live and die under the shadow of that choice. The next moves he makes will show what he truly believed that shot meant. Dutch's answer to that shot is not an apology or a reckoning. It is motion. From the very beginning of the escape, the gang is forced into a pilgrimage they never chose, carrying Blackwater with them as an invisible passenger. The docks give way to gunfire, the river to snow, and one bad night hardens into a permanent season. The flight north to Coulter is more than a change of scenery, it is an exile. Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender die on the road, their bodies claimed by the cold before the Pinkertons can. The gang huddles in ruined cabins, listening to the wind claw at the walls, and the massacre becomes a story told in half-finished sentences and haunted glances. Freedom is suddenly reduced to staying one step ahead of civilization's reach, and that is where the cracks in loyalty begin to show. For Arthur, Blackwater is the moment Dutch's philosophy stops matching the world he sees. He has lost people he cared about, watched a girl named Heidi McCourt die for bonds he never even touches, and now hears Dutch insist that it was all necessary, all noble, all part of a greater plan. Arthur's faith is shaken, his resentment simmering beneath the surface, yet he still rides behind Dutch through Coulter, Horseshoe Overlook, Clemens Point. Why? Because from its humble beginnings, this gang was his family, and Arthur Morgan is, in the truest sense, a man who would rather doubt himself than admit his father figure is failing him. John's place in that family changes in the snow. His injuries and absence around Blackwater become a convenient myth Dutch can cling to. John ran, John hid, John did not bleed for the cause. Once the favored son, the living embodiment of Dutch's dreams of raising a boy into a better version of himself, John turns into a symbol of betrayal in Dutch's mind. Every time John is late returning to camp, every time he questions a plan, Blackwater is silently retried. The verdict only grows harsher. Micah, meanwhile, discovers opportunity in the ashes. He is the one Dutch credits with getting them out, the one who claims he stood tall when others faltered. The failed job becomes his leverage. As the gang moves south, Micah whispers that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, that only boldness and brutality will keep them free. Dutch hears not poison, but confirmation. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, now has a new narrator at his shoulder. By the time the camp rots in the swamps of Shady Bell and collapses into the darkness of Beaver Hollow, the massacre at Blackwater has quietly rewritten every bond. Arthur's devotion is frayed, John's honor is doubted, Micah's influence is entrenched, and Dutch's paranoia is gospel. The gang still rides together, still calls itself a family, but every ride carries an unspoken question. When the next shot echoes out of the smoke, who will Dutch choose to stand behind it? And in the end, who will still be willing to stand beside him? And some of the people who once stood beside him never even make it out of the smoke. The Blackwater Massacre is remembered for the missing money and the headlines, but beneath the Pinkerton reports and bounty posters lies something quieter and crueler, the ghosts no one sees. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's gang is not just an outfit of hired guns. It is, in the truest sense, a family. Jenny Kirk is one of the early believers, a young woman pulled from hardship and given a bed, a horse, and a place at the fire. Davy Callender is another stray, a reckless rider whose laughter fills the camp and whose loyalty is never in doubt. Heidi McCourt is different. She is not an outlaw at all, just a girl on a ferry, a civilian who happens to stand between Dutch's dreams and a pile of bonds. Together they form the edges of the picture, the faces that prove this is a story of more than legends and wanted posters. Jenny helps with the chores, sings, keeps spirits up on long, hungry nights. Davy rides on jobs, shares jokes with Arthur and the others, a living embodiment of that early, idealistic belief that this gang can outrun civilization forever. Heidi never shares a campfire, never hears Dutch's philosophy. Her only role is to die screaming on a deck slick with blood. The game never shows those moments. Jenny and Davy's deaths occur off-screen, mentioned in fragments as the gang freezes its way through the mountains. Davy is already dying when the opening begins, slumped in the wagon, his blood soaking through the blankets while Arthur and Dutch argue about where to go next. Jenny is gone before the player ever takes a step, her death reduced to a line in camp dialogue and a grave in the snow. Heidi McCourt is worse still, a name tucked into newspapers and background conversations, a casualty the gang barely admits to itself. That narrative choice is not an accident. The gang buries its grief the same way the story does, under work, under motion, under the next robbery. Arthur mentions Davy in the blizzard with a weary tenderness, then forces himself forward. John never speaks at length about Jenny, though their time together lingers in the way he later clings to Abigail and Jack. And Heidi's name? Almost never spoken. What does it mean when even the killers refuse to say the girl's name out loud? Dutch carries those ghosts in his silences and in his delusions. He insists Blackwater was a simple job gone wrong, that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying and forced his hand. He rants about betrayal, about spies, about civilization crushing freedom, But he never truly reckons with Jenny's frozen body, Davy's rattling breaths, or Heidi McCourt's terror. To acknowledge them would be to admit that his grand philosophy has a human cost he cannot justify. These quiet losses turn Blackwater from a failed heist into a moral wound. Every camp that follows, every desperate plan is haunted by people who are no longer there to speak for themselves. And there is one more truth the gang keeps running from, one more ghost the story only whispers about. The massacre was not just a tragedy of chance, but the result of choices made long before the ferry ever left the dock. Those choices echo loudest in the quietest place, a town that refuses to remember how it was built. By the time the story reaches its epilogue, Blackwater has become the living embodiment of the new century Dutch always claimed to hate. The streets are swept, the storefronts are painted, the lamps burn bright against the lake, holding the night at bay as if violence were just a bad dream. From its humble beginnings as a rough river port, Blackwater has polished itself into a model of civilization. Policemen stroll in pairs, not to fight a war, but to reassure investors. Gentlemen in bowler hats discuss railroads and bonds where gunmen once argued over cattle. Ladies step off the steamboats in pressed dresses, never knowing that the same docks ran red during the massacre. The world was changing, and Blackwater decided to change with it, not by confessing its sins, but by paving over them. In this new order, the massacre becomes a story of law and order triumphing over savagery. Newspapers print tidy columns about the notorious Van der Linde gang and the heroic Pinkertons who stopped them. Saloons turn the ferry disaster into a cautionary tale told between hands of cards and polite laughter. Boatmen whisper about a dead girl on the deck, about Heidi McCourt. But even that horror is folded into a simple moral: crime does not pay. The gang's fear, their confusion, the betrayals and miscalculations that led to that dock are erased, replaced with a legend that flatters the survivors who remained. History, in the truest sense, becomes a civic asset. The town that once locked itself down with snipers and patrols now sells itself as a safe haven, a place where the old ways were dying and progress won. The official story is clean. The truth is not. Into this curated memory walks John Marston, no longer the brash outlaw, but a rancher in worn clothes, a husband and father trying to buy lumber and supplies. He passes men who once would have taken up rifles to hunt him, and now they barely glance at his face. A bounty that defined his existence has been reduced to a fading poster, if it exists at all. The town that hunted his old life to extinction cannot even be bothered to remember his name. For John, for the survivors, Blackwater is a ghost they still carry. For Blackwater, the gang is just a paragraph. That is the quiet cruelty of this world. Trauma lingers in those who lost everything, while the places that profited move on. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is trimmed down into a simple fable about bandits and heroes. So who truly owns the past? The dead on the ferry, or the bankers on the boardwalk who tell the tale? As the epilogue unfolds, Blackwater stands as proof that the ones who lived to write the records decide what was justified, what was tragic, and what was best forgotten, setting the stage for how John's own legend will be used next. To trace Dutch's end, the story has to run backward. The man who walks away on that snowy peak in the epilogue is already standing on the docks of Blackwater, pistol in hand, insisting that everything is someone else's fault. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang followed a man who preached freedom, family, and a philosophy of resistance. Dutch was the living embodiment of the noble outlaw myth, robbing the rich and corrupt and dressing theft up as justice. But on that ferry, when he shot Heidi McCourt rather than surrender, the mask slipped. In a single moment, the idealistic teacher became the man who would kill a terrified girl to prove he would never bow to civilization. That decision is the fracture line that runs through the rest of the game. Dutch tells himself it was necessary, that the Pinkertons forced his hand, that Blackwater was a setup. Maybe it was. Yet the important part is not whether he is right, but that from that moment he needs to be right more than he needs to be good. The old ways were dying, the world was changing, and instead of adapting, Dutch doubles down. He cannot let the ferry be a tragedy. It has to be a betrayal. Look at Strawberry. When Micah is jailed, Dutch charges in with theatrical outrage, burning the town and gunning down deputies for the sake of one man who had already dragged the gang into chaos. A leader thinking clearly would cut losses. Dutch, still reliving Blackwater, refuses to leave anyone behind again, even as he creates the very massacre he claims to abhor. The echo of that dockside refusal to surrender is unmistakable. In Saint Denis, the pattern tightens. The bank heist is sold as redemption, the job that will erase Blackwater and prove Dutch's philosophy right. Instead, Hosea and Lenny die, and Dutch, cornered on the rooftop, again will not yield. He curses the city, the law, the progress he once claimed to understand. His rhetoric about freedom curdles into self-justification. They are persecuted, they are martyrs, they are never wrong. Is this still a story of resistance, or just a man fleeing his own reflection? Guarma and Beaver Hollow complete the reversal. On the island, Dutch sides with a slaver, then abandons the rebels the moment their usefulness ends. At Beaver Hollow, he lets the gang starve while chasing phantom scores and Micah's whispers. The man who once rescued lost soul after lost soul now sacrifices Arthur, John, even his own code to keep the dream alive on paper. In the truest sense, the massacre never ends. It just moves locations. So when Dutch appears in the epilogue, gaunt and distant, his final act with Micah is not a new leaf. It is the exhausted conclusion of the same pattern that began in the smoke over Blackwater. To understand why he finally walks away on that mountain, the question has to be asked, what did he really walk away from on that dock? And what did he secretly carry with him forever? Because buried in that answer is the last uncomfortable truth about what Blackwater meant. Because buried in that answer is the last uncomfortable truth about what Blackwater meant. It was not just a robbery gone wrong. It was a verdict. From the very beginning, forces Dutch could not see were already arranging the stage, tightening the noose, deciding that men who lived between freedom and civilization would no longer be tolerated. The massacre on that ferry was a story of a world making up its mind. Blackwater in 1899 is not some dusty frontier town from its humble beginnings. It is polished streets, brick buildings, telegraph wires humming overhead. It is banks, investors, and a new class of men who do their killing with contracts and influence instead of revolvers. These are the people who hire the Pinkertons, fund the railroads, and quietly whisper into the ears of mayors and marshals. And somewhere downriver, in Saint Denis, Angelo Bronte is the living embodiment of that new order. Bronte never sets foot in Blackwater on screen, yet his fingerprints are everywhere in the region's power structure. He owns police captains, judges, and business interests from Lemoyne to the Heartlands. He entertains industrialists, speculators, and railroad men at his mansion while discussing bonds, land, and security. Is it really a stretch to imagine that the same networks that make Bronte untouchable in Saint Denis also stiffen Blackwater's spine when Dutch's gang comes sniffing around a ferry full of cash and government bonds? The ambush feels less like bad luck and more like policy. The Pinkertons are not stumbling into an outlaw scrape. They are in position, armed, coordinated, waiting for a message. A ferry is chosen that carries not only money but bonds, paper that ties Blackwater's elites to Eastern banks and federal interests. A civilian girl, Heidi McCourt, dies on that deck, and within hours the story is fixed. Savage outlaws, innocent blood, lawmen forced to respond with overwhelming force. Convenient for everyone who wants the old ways to disappear. Dutch tells himself he is fighting the law. Men with badges, men with rifles. But the real enemy is in the ledgers and parlors he never truly understands. He is up against banks whose money built the railroads, against railroads whose tracks dictate which towns live and which die, against politicians who trade safety for votes, against men like Bronte who can buy justice wholesale and sell it back at a profit. In the truest sense, Dutch is not just an outlaw, he is an inconvenience. And that is why Blackwater is the hinge of the entire saga. Before that dock, the gang's story is still a story of romantic outlaws chasing dreams on a fading frontier. After it, the tone shifts. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's campfire philosophy now stands in the path of industrial power that does not negotiate. Even if the gang cannot see the full shape of what hit them, the trajectory is set. The massacre locks Blackwater down, raises bounties, and puts the Van der Linde name on wanted posters from New Hanover to Lemoyne. But the real consequence is quieter. Dutch has been marked. So when the gang finally limps into Saint Denis and meets Angelo Bronte face to face, the question lingers beneath every polite word and shared cigar. Is Dutch negotiating with a man he might outsmart? or with one of the unseen architects who already decided his fate back on that ferry. Because if Blackwater was a verdict, Saint Denis will be the sentence. To understand that sentence, the verdict has to be replayed from the very beginning. Before the smoke on the docks, before the headlines about a massacre, there was a plan that promised salvation, not ruin. By 1899, Dutch's ambition had outgrown his circumstances. The gang had money, reputation, and a philosophy, but the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. Dutch wanted one last, decisive score. A ferry in Blackwater carrying cash and government bonds, the kind of haul that could buy permanent freedom. Micah Bell, newly arrived and eager to impress, whispered that this was destiny. That Dutch was the living embodiment of the outlaw who could beat civilization at its own game. Hosea hesitated. Arthur sensed the stakes had shifted. The older hands had seen big scores before, but this felt different, heavier, as if Dutch was no longer robbing for the gang, but for the grand idea of himself. Still, the plan moved forward. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, John, Javier, Bill, Micah, and others converged on Blackwater. The town was prosperous, watched, civilized in the truest sense, with Pinkertons already sniffing around. Dutch insisted the ferry would be simple. Board, control the passengers, grab the money, vanish into the night. But the very choice of target betrayed how far he had drifted from his own rhetoric. This was not a corrupt magnate in some isolated mansion. This was a public vessel, full of civilians. On the day of the job, the gang boarded or surrounded the ferry as it prepared to leave the docks. The money was there, strongboxes, bonds, the tangible weight of all Dutch's dreams and delusions. So were the passengers, including a young woman named Heidi McCourt. Somewhere between Dutch's commands and Micah's volatility, a gun went off, or a decision was made, and Heidi died in the crossfire, a single civilian death that would define the entire story. Almost at once, the trap snapped shut. Pinkertons and local law, already in position, opened fire. This was no quick reaction. This was a waiting noose. What followed was chaos. Gunfire tore through the ferry and the docks. Some gang members fell there. Others were hit in the frantic retreat through the town and into the wilderness. Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender did not die on the boat, but their wounds on that escape route would finish them in the snow above Coulter. John was separated, badly hurt, crawling through the storm while the gang believed him lost or dead. The family that had ridden together for years was suddenly scattered by smoke, fear, and conflicting orders. In that confusion, the money vanished. Perhaps it was stashed on the shore, perhaps on the boat, perhaps moved by hands working against the gang. Practically, it meant starvation and desperation in the mountains. Symbolically, it was worse. The physical embodiment of Dutch's promise had been reduced to rumor and excuse. How many times would he point back toward Blackwater and insist that if they could just reclaim that score, everything would be set right? This is where the timeline of the Van der Linde gang bends. Before Blackwater, from its humble beginnings, the gang's trajectory was upward, an outlaw family growing in confidence and legend. After Blackwater, every camp is a retreat, every plan is a gamble, every death feels less meaningful and more senseless. A single sequence of events on a ferry and a dock becomes the hinge on which the entire narrative turns, transforming Dutch from rebel philosopher into hunted warlord, and turning the dream of freedom into a slow, inevitable fall. Yet even here, questions linger. Who told the Pinkertons? Who really touched that money last? Those shadows will follow the gang to Saint Denis and to Angelo Bronte's door. Those shadows are the point. Because in the end, Blackwater is not really a mystery to be solved. It is a reckoning that has to be lived with. On paper, it is a simple heist gone wrong. A ferry, some bonds, a fast escape. In Dutch's mind, it is the latest chapter in a story of noble outlaws striking back at a corrupt civilization. But Blackwater is where that philosophy finally collides with a world that has stopped believing in him. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. And Dutch van der Linde, the living embodiment of frontier rebellion, walks into a modern port city and discovers that his myth no longer scares anyone with real power. From its humble beginnings, the gang could pretend that robbing trains and stagecoaches was a form of rough justice. Blackwater strips that illusion bare. The Pinkertons do not just show up by chance. They are waiting, organized, coordinated, armed with information that came from telegraphs. informants, and boardroom conversations in places Dutch will never see. The massacre on the docks is the moment the gang's campfire legends meet the machinery of civilization, and the legends lose. That is why so much is left unanswered. Who tipped off the law? How deep did Angelo Bronte's influence run in that town? How much money was actually on that ferry? And who walked away with it? The game never fully says, because in the truest sense, the characters do not know either. Those blank spaces are intentional scars. They force every survivor to carry uncertainty as part of their grief, to replay the same few remembered seconds on the deck of that boat and never quite understand what went wrong. The missing cash becomes more than a bag of bonds. It becomes the ghost of Dutch's promise that one last score will fix everything. The unclear body count turns every mention of Heidi McCourt, every grave for Jenny or Davy, into a question without an answer. Was it worth it? Could it have been different? That uncertainty is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, compressed into a single night. Every major theme in Red Dead Redemption 2 passes through that dock. Loyalty, as Arthur rides into the snow still believing Dutch has a plan. Progress, as Blackwater locks down with snipers, newspapers, and wanted posters, transforming the gang from romantic outlaws into hunted terrorists. Betrayal, as Micah's star rises and John's old wounds are reopened. The death of the West, as an idealistic camp that once talked about freedom and family becomes a caravan of refugees fleeing a crime scene they can never revisit. Blackwater becomes the invisible prologue and the permanent epilogue to the saga. It starts Arthur's final chapter the moment he leaves that town behind, and it still hangs over John's ranch years later, in every bounty notice, in every fearful whisper about the massacre. The guns go quiet, but the ferry never really docks, and as the gang scatters, one figure carries that night differently from all the others. He carries it as prophecy, as warning, as a wound that never quite closes. Because once the docks of Blackwater fade behind the gang, nothing that follows is random misfortune. It is all the slow echo of one night on a ferry that the game almost never shows. Across this journey, that echo has been traced from its humble beginnings, in whispered plans and quiet meetings, through the real timeline of the heist itself. The gang did not simply stumble into disaster. The world was changing around them. The ferry, the cash and bonds, the Pinkertons already in position, the hidden hands of Bronte and the Blackwater elite turning a simple job into a carefully arranged execution. From the very beginning, the massacre is not just a robbery gone wrong, but a story of power protecting itself and using the gang as expendable proof that the old ways were dying. The Forgotten Dead marked that turning point in the truest sense. Jenny Kirk and Davy Callender freezing and bleeding out in the mountains because of what happened on that boat. Heidi McCourt, a civilian whose name survives only in fragments of dialogue and in the bounty posters that brand the gang as butchers. Their absence reshapes Dutch's philosophy, tightens Arthur's jaw in every argument, and hardens John's silence years later. The living embodiment of the massacre is not the bodies on the ferry, but the people left behind trying to pretend that night still made sense. With this deeper version in mind, early camp conversations no longer feel like idle chatter. Dutch's speeches at Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, full of grand promises about freedom and civilization, start to sound less like leadership and more like a man arguing with his own guilt. Those tense glances when Blackwater is mentioned, Hosea's weary corrections, Arthur's clipped responses, Micah's smug prodding, all become small aftershocks of the same explosion. Even the gang's idealistic talk of family and loyalty carries a crack through the middle, as if everyone knows that loyalty already failed someone on that dock. And then comes John, walking Blackwater streets in the epilogue, moving through a town that remembers a version of the story he can never fully correct. Bounty notices still hang, citizens still mutter about monsters on a ferry, lawmen still patrol as if the massacre might happen again tomorrow. Every quiet step is a man haunted by a place he cannot leave, trying to build a ranch under the shadow of a harbor that never forgave him. So the next playthrough becomes something different. Not just a tale of outlaws on the run, but a story of people haunted by a night the camera refuses to show. Every offhand mention of Blackwater becomes an echo from a ghost. Every nervous glance toward the west, every argument about bonds or Pinkertons, a reminder that the real first chapter is missing. If this unraveling of the massacre casts the gang in a new light, let that echo continue. Share theories about what really happened on that ferry. about who knew what and when. Subscribe to follow the next piece of the Vanderlinde saga and call out which corner of Red Dead lore should be pulled apart next, until every hidden prologue and every buried epilogue finally steps into the light.